Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Sometimes being American is so boring, what with my gold hockey medal and 1,200-calorie breakfasts. So I'm happy to say that I have a fun episode for you today that immerses us in a story straight from Scotland. A story about a man working to feed his family, but must endure the most hellish road in the world. This story, from One with the Contour, is titled The Drove Road. This is a tale from the Break Room. And you can find Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Follow us and leave us a rating if you like us. Thank you. My father was a livestock haulier in the Scottish Highlands for 31 years. He moved sheep and cattle between farms and markets across some of the most remote country in Britain, driving roads that don't appear on most maps, in weather that would keep sensible people indoors. In all that time, he only ever refused one route. If a contract required the B road between Kinlochmore and Cannock, he passed it to another driver and took the financial hit. And if you asked him why, he would change the subject so fast, you'd find yourself talking about football or the price of diesel before you realized what happened. He did this for 3 decades, and in those 3 decades, he explained himself exactly once. On the second to last night of his life, no less, in a hospital room in Inverness in the winter of 2004. 30 years of Richmond Super Kings had turned his lungs into something that could barely process air, and the man in that bed was so far from the man I grew up with that I had to remind myself more than once that they were the same person. He'd lost 4 stone. His skin had gone the color of dishwater. He breathed through a mask that fogged over with each exhale and cleared just enough between breaths to show his mouth moving underneath. And most of what he said in those final days was fragmented, drifting, half dissolved by morphine and exhaustion. But on that second to last night, when I was sitting beside his bed during a late visit because my mum had gone home to sleep and someone needed to be there, he turned his head on the pillow and looked at me with perfect clarity, saying, "Close the door." I closed it. He said to me, "Sit down." And so I sat. He then told me about the Drove Road, and he told it from beginning to end in a level and steady voice. But his eyes stayed fixated on the ceiling the entire time, like he was reading the story off the tiles. He talked for about an hour. When he was done, he closed his eyes for some time. I sat there, wordless, because there was nothing adequate to reply with. He died the following morning at 6:30. I was in the corridor getting coffee from the machine when it happened. That became one of those details that really shouldn't matter, but now I can't stop thinking about. Why was I grabbing coffee? Did it really matter? I've never repeated what he told me that night, but I am going to now. I'm 57 years old now, and this story deserves to be told. Also, as a note before I begin, I've changed all instances of kilometers to miles. I've spent most of my life in America at this point, and I know most people reading this will likely be American too. My father, Alistair, grew up in a village near Bewley, about 12 miles west of Inverness. He left school at 15. School wasn't producing results for anyone involved, and he got work on farms around the Glen, which in the Highlands in the late 1950s was less a career choice than a gravitational inevitability. He was good with animals, and good with engines too, but not particularly good with people, which is a combination that either makes you a mechanic or a haulier. When he got his HGV license at 20, he found that driving a loaded truck through empty landscape for hours at a stretch suited him quite well. He bought a second-hand Bedford TK from a dealer in Dingwall, and a livestock trailer from a farmer in Muir of Ord who was getting out of sheep. And by his mid-20s, he was making a decent living moving animals around the north of Scotland. Livestock haulage is unglamorous work, and I won't dwell on it long, but you need to understand a few things to follow what happened. A Hollier's reputation depends on delivering animals in the same condition he collected them. Stressed sheep lose weight, panicked sheep trample each other. A bruise on a ewe's flank or a limp that wasn't there at loading is a mark against the driver, and enough marks mean farmers stop calling. My father was careful. He checked his trailer before every job. The floor, the walls, partition gates, bolts and hinges and welds. You see, a loose fitting or a sharp edge in a livestock trailer is a liability, and because he took a workman's pride in doing the job properly, he checked it thoroughly. I say this to you so you understand that when animals came off his trailer injured, he knew it wasn't the trailer. In the autumn of 1972, my father had said late October or early November, but he wasn't certain on the exact date. But he picked up a contract from a farmer named Drummond. Drummond ran a hill farm in a remote glen west of Cannock, which itself is a remote place, and he needed 60-odd blackface ewes moved to a lowland farm near Bewley for winter grazing. The distance was about 30 miles of road, but the route mattered more than the distance, because the most direct way between the 2 points involved a 12-mile stretch of single-track B road that crossed open moorland between the 2 glens. This road followed the line of what was locally called the Drove Road. Drove roads are old routes, some of them medieval, which were used for centuries to walk livestock to market. Scotland is full of them. Most have been paved over or absorbed into the modern road network, and you would never know you were driving on one unless someone told you. This one, though, was different, at least according to my father, because the locals still called it by a Gaelic name that he said translated to something like the Road of the Carried Dead. It had been a corpse road before it was a drove road, the path along which the dead were carried from the remote communities in the western glens to consecrated ground in the east. My father mentioned this as a background detail, but I could hear something underneath the words even through the morphine and the steady tone, something that suggested he wished he'd paid more attention to it at the time. He had driven the road before without incident, though he noted, and I remember him pausing here briefly as if catching himself, that he had always driven it during daylight. The Drummond contract was different because of the logistics. Drummond's farm was at the end of a 5-mile track that was more suggestion than road, and the loading process with hill sheep is slow. Because the animals are half wild, they don't share the lowland sheep's resignation about being pushed into a trailer. By the time Alistair got the first batch loaded and cleared the farm track and reached the B road, the light would be gone. November in the Scottish Highlands means the sun sets at 4:30, and 4:30 comes faster than you expect when you're wrestling blackface ewes up a ramp. I should describe the road here. It's a single-track tarmac with passing places, no markings, no cat's eyes, no lighting. It crosses open moorland, flat peat bog stretching away on both sides, treeless, featureless, with low hills on the horizon that are more felt than seen after dark. The road sits slightly raised above the bog, like a causeway, which means that in wet weather, the standing water on either side reflects your headlights back at you, and it can feel like driving across a black lake on a narrow bridge. In daylight, it's bleak but manageable. After dark, with nothing ahead of you but the reach of your headlamps and nothing behind but whatever you've already passed, it becomes something else. My father described it as driving through the inside of a closed eye. The first trip was in late October. He loaded 20-odd ewes at Drummond's place in the late afternoon. Drummond was there to help. My father described him as the kind of older Highland farmer who communicates primarily through hand gestures and monosyllabic instructions, delivered at a volume meant for someone standing 50 yards away on a hillside. They got the sheep loaded. Drummond closed the trailer gate and bolted it. Then my father pulled out. He made it to the moor road at dusk. The last of the daylight was a thin orange band on the western horizon, and the road ahead was already dark enough to need headlights. The sheep in the trailer were settled, which was what you wanted. The ramp and the loading are the stressful parts, and once they're in and moving, they usually calm down. He drove the 12-mile stretch at a steady 40, which is about as fast as you'd want to push a loaded livestock trailer on a single track. About halfway across, he noticed the time. The 12 miles at 40 should take roughly 18 minutes, and he'd been driving for what felt like about that long. But the cattle grid at the far end of the moor, the landmark that meant you were off the open ground and dropping into the next glen, had not yet appeared. He checked his watch. 25 minutes. He wasn't worried yet, just mildly confused. He thought perhaps he had misjudged his start time, or maybe he had gone slower than he'd thought. Maybe both. So he kept driving. The cattle grid appeared after 47 minutes on this 12-mile road. My father was not a man who made errors about things like speed and distance. He had been driving professionally for the better part of a decade by then, and he could estimate his speed within a mile or two per hour without looking at the dial. He knew how long 12 miles took at 40. It didn't take 47 minutes. He shrugged it off as something odd and carried on to the destination farm. Because practical men like him, well, they archive things away, and they carry on. After all, there's no useful response to a road being longer than it should be. He unloaded at the receiving farm near Bewley. The farmer was a man called Geddes, and Geddes was waiting with the gate open and a torch in his hand, as it was past 7 by then and fully dark. They dropped the ramp and the sheep came out. The first 17 or 18 were fine. They trotted down the ramp and into the pen, in that stop-start uncertain way, like animals do when they're adjusting to solid ground after a moving floor. The last two, however, were limping. Both ewes, both favoring their front left leg, both with the same stiff, pained reluctance to put weight on it. And behind them, the last animal out, a ewe with a gash along her right flank that ran from just behind the shoulder almost to the hip. It was deep, deep enough that the flesh had parted, and you could see the pink of the muscle underneath. It was clean, almost surgically straight, as if it had been made with a blade, and not by an animal catching itself on some protruding edge. Geddes looked at the injuries, then at my father. My father said it wasn't quite an accusatory look he gave him, but certainly something that wanted explanation. Yet my father didn't have one. He had checked the trailer before loading, as he always did, and there was nothing in it that could produce a wound like that. Geddes cleaned the gash with iodine and wrapped it, and they agreed that the ewes must have knocked into each other during transit, which can happen when animals panic and scramble. Except these sheep had never panicked, not during the ride. They had been calm the entire way. My father had listened to the sounds of distress before. Stamping, bleating, the thud of bodies hitting the trailer walls, and had heard nothing on this trip. He drove home to Bewley and told my mother the delivery had gone fine. I mean, in the accounting of his mind, it had. Sheep sometimes arrive with injuries. Sometimes they have injuries as they load and you miss it. It was an imperfect business. He went to bed, he slept, and if he dreamed about anything, he didn't remember it in the morning. The second trip was 4 days later. The same route and the same time of day. Same conditions. An afternoon loading and a dusk departure that put him on the moor road after dark. This time he watched his clock from the moment his tires hit the single track. He drove at a careful, consistent 40, and he did not speed up or slow down, and he counted the minutes. The 12-mile crossing took 44 minutes, which at 40 miles per hour is a distance of just over 29 miles. The road was 12 miles long. He had just driven 29. He said nothing about this to anyone. It didn't make sense. He didn't want to dwell on it. Perhaps there was an error. If it was an error, it was not in his equipment, though. It had to be on the road. Perhaps the signs, perhaps something. He didn't know. At the Geddes farm, they unloaded. 3 ewes were injured this time, all with the same clean lacerations on the left side of the body, like something in the trailer was making a single cut across each animal at the same height and from the same direction. And there was one more, too. She was standing at the back of the trailer, facing the wall when they opened the gate. She didn't move when the others filed out, and when Geddes climbed in, coaxing her to turn around, he stepped back and said something under his breath in Gaelic that my father didn't catch. The poor thing's left eye was gone. The socket was open and empty and clean, like the eye had been lifted out by a surgeon, not torn or burst, and there was almost no blood. Maybe some thin, dry residue on the wool below the socket, but that's it. The ewe stood there and looked at them with her remaining eye, and she was calm. Entirely, horribly calm. My father wondered if it was adrenaline caused by the pain and fear. He and Getty stood in the yard with a torch beam on that empty socket, and they didn't talk as they observed. Eventually, Getty said it must have been a bolt, maybe a rough edge in the trailer, something the ewe had pressed her face against. My father knew every surface in that trailer down to the inch, and there was nothing that could do what had been done. He and Getty's both knew this, but neither of them said so out loud, and that knowing set between them like a stone. He drove home. He checked the trailer in the morning with a torch, running his hands over every surface, every join, and every bolt head. But he didn't find anything out of place. The interior walls were smooth, galvanized steel. The floor was clean. He couldn't even find blood anywhere, which itself was messed up. A wound like that eye, especially, should have left blood on the floor, on the walls, or somewhere. The trailer was as clean as the day he had loaded it. That night he dreamed he was walking the moor road in the dark, on foot, alone. There was something behind him matching his pace step for step, with a half-second delay, so that each of his footfalls produced an echo that was not quite an echo, as it came from the wrong direction. He walked for hours, and the road did not end. He woke up in his bed, with his heart going a mile a minute, and my mom asleep beside him. He told himself it was a dream. Then he went downstairs and found his work boots by the front door, with black peat mud on the soles. He stood there in the kitchen in the early light and looked at those boots. You see, he did not own peat land, and he had not gone outside as far as he could remember. My father nearly refused the third run. He phoned Drummond and said he was busy, which was a lie. November was slow, and he had no other contracts that week. Drummond offered more money, and my father said it wasn't the money. Drummond then cleared his throat and asked, "Your wife's expecting, isn't she?" And my father said yes. My mother was 6 months pregnant with me at the time, a detail I've never been able to sit comfortably with. Drummond then explained how he needed the work, and so offered him double the rate. My father said no, so Drummond said something else. My father repeated it to me in the hospital, exactly as he remembered it. And I'll do that for you as well. Drummond had said, "You've been across 3 times now, Alistair. Twice there, once back empty. That's 3 crossings of a road that wants 4. You think it matters whether you're driving it? You walked it last night in your sleep. It'll have you walking it every night until you finish what you started, or until it finishes for you." My father asked how Drummond knew about the walking, but he didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "Finish the contract. 4 loaded crossings, that's a full drove. That's what the road wants. Leave it at 3, and that there's unfinished business. And that road has been collecting unfinished business since before your grandfather's grandfather was born." My father took the job. I don't know why. He didn't explain his reasoning to me, and I've spent 2 decades considering the possibilities, and I still can't settle on one. The money was part of it. We were not well off, and a baby was coming. Double rate for a day's work was not something he could dismiss easily. But obviously it was more than that. I think Drummond's mention of the sleepwalking frightened him in such a way. It confirmed that what was happening was not contained to the road. It was following him home. The peat on his boots, the dreams, the road reaching into his house while he slept. If Drummond was right, then driving the road again was not adding to the danger. The danger was already present, accumulating, and the only way to discharge it was to complete the crossing, give the road what it wanted. He loaded the third batch at Drummond's farm on a gray afternoon in the second week of November. The sky was low and flat. The highland was overcast, making it impossible to tell where the sun was or how much light you had left. And the darkness, when it came, arrived without a transitional period. 1 minute, the moor was visible in washed-out gray, and the next, the headlights were cutting tunnels through solid black. He was on the moor road by 4:45. At mile 6, confirmed by his odometer, which he was now checking obsessively, he saw the figure. It was on the road ahead of him, walking the left-hand edge in the same direction he was traveling. His headlights picked it up at about 100 yards. The outline of a person, tall, wearing what appeared to be a long coat, hunched forward under the weight of something draped across his shoulders. The posture was that of a man carrying a heavy load, bent at the waist, arms raised to grip whatever was slung behind his neck. My father's first thought was that it was a stalker, not what you'd think when you hear the word stalker, but rather a deer hunter coming off the hill with a carcass. You carry a deer across your shoulders with the legs hanging down your chest, and from behind in poor light, that's approximately what this looked like. He slowed the truck. The road was single track and there was no room to pass without the figure stepping aside, so he dropped to walking pace and flashed his headlights. The figure, though, did not react. He tapped his horn, a short bleat that sounded enormous in the moorland silence, but no response. The figure kept walking at the same pace. My father rolled along behind it at 5 miles per hour, with his headlights fully on its back, and so more details began to resolve. The coat was long past the knees, and it was not a modern garment. My father said it looked heavy and shapeless, like rough wool or oilskin that you see in old photographs of agricultural workers from a century ago. The figure moved wrong too, stiff and repetitive, like the legs beneath the coat were operating on a mechanism, not through muscular intent. Each step was identical to the last in length and timing, no variation, no adjustment for the camber of the road or the rough surface. This was not like a living man's walk, constantly adapting to the ground beneath them. This was a walk that had been fixed and placed, and was simply repeating. The thing across its shoulders was no deer. The legs hanging down the figure's chest. My father could see them clearly now in the headlights, swaying with each step, were too thin and ended in small cloven hooves, and there were too many of them. He counted at least 4 distinct legs, possibly 6, layered over each other, which meant the figure was carrying more than one animal. Sheep. Dead sheep. Draped and stacked across its shoulders, and it was walking the drove road at 5 o'clock on a November night, as though this were a task it had been performing for a very long time, and intended to perform for a great deal longer. My father stopped the truck. He told me he didn't know why he did. Every functioning part of his brain was telling him to accelerate and get clear of this, but his foot went to the brake, and his hands went still. He sat in the idling cab with his headlights on the figure 20 yards ahead. He couldn't look away from it, and he couldn't move. He said it was like the road was holding him there, like he was trapped in some unseen current. Some unseen force had interposed itself and had told him to wait. The sheep in the trailer then started screaming. My father used that word specifically, and I'll use it here. He was a man who had spent his adult life around livestock. He knew the full range of sounds they make, and what came out of that trailer was not bleating and was not distress calls. It was a sound he had never heard from sheep before, and he said it was the sound of animals who knew, in whatever limited way that sheep could know anything, that something was present that was fundamentally incompatible with their being alive. The sound broke whatever was holding him. He released the brake, put the truck in second, and floored the accelerator. The Bedford lurched past the figure on the narrow road, doing 50 on a surface that was barely safe at 30. As he passed, he looked to his left through the driver's side window, and the figure was there, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if the glass hadn't been between them. He saw its face then. My father described this once. Back in that hospital bed with his eyes on the ceiling, his voice perfectly steady, and his free hand gripping the bed rail so hard that the tendons rose up through the skin like cables. When he was done describing it, he closed his eyes and didn't open them for a full minute. I sat there and listened to his breathing apparatus cycle, and I didn't say a word. The face had been a man's face. My father was certain of this. The underlying structure was human, the proportions were human. The basic architecture of brow and cheekbone and jaw was that of a grown man. But the flesh over that structure had been transformed in a way that my father could only compare to the photographs he'd seen of bog bodies pulled from peat. The skin darkened to a deep reddish brown, compressed tight against the skull, shrunk and hardened by acid and time until it was less skin than leather. The lips drawn back from the teeth in a permanent, involuntary grimace, the sockets deep and shadowed. Peat preserved, tanned by centuries in the ground. The ground tans everything it keeps long enough. The eyes in those sockets were open. They were wet and they moved. They tracked the truck as it passed, and my father said that in the half-second he saw them, he understood that the face was dead, but that the eyes were not. That contradiction was the worst part. Something was looking out of that face that had no business being behind dead eyes, and it saw him clearly. And yet it was not surprised to see him there. He drove the remaining 6 miles without slowing down. His odometer recorded the distance as 9. He was past questioning this by then. At the Geddes farm, they opened the trailer. 14 of the 15 sheep walked out in good order. The 15th was at the back of the trailer, at the far corner, and it wasn't standing up. Now I must describe what my father described to me, and I'll do it plainly, though it is bizarre and disturbing. The ewe was on its side. It was definitely alive. My father could see its ribcage moving, shallow but rapid breathing. Its eyes were open, and its legs were making small rhythmic paddling motions, like a dying animal's legs moving as the nervous system fails. But the animal's not dying from any wound or impact. Well, nothing that made sense anyway. You see, its abdomen had been opened up. The skin and wool of the belly had been parted along a line so clean and straight, it looked measured, from the sternum to the pelvis, and the 2 flaps of skin had been folded back, laid flat against the ground on either side of the body, like the pages of some book. The interior of the animal was exposed. Organs, musculature, the architecture of a living sheep presented in cross-section, as though for a veterinary demonstration. The organs had been rearranged. The stomach and intestines, which should have been in the abdominal cavity, had been drawn out and placed on the exterior of the body in positions that corresponded roughly to where they would sit if the animal's inside and outside had been reversed. The liver was where the wool should have been. The wool was underneath. Everything was in the wrong place but arranged with intent. Something with horrible creativity had opened this animal up and tried to put it back together according to a different set of instructions. Somehow, the ewe was breathing through all of this. Its legs were still paddling. Its eye, the one my father could see, was open and looking at nothing. My father and Geddes stood at the back of that trailer in the dark farmyard with a single torch beam on the poor animal, and neither of them said a word. My father said they stood there for minutes, which feels like years when you're standing in silence looking at something impossible. Geddes then climbed into the trailer, cutting the ewe's throat with his penknife. The breathing stopped. The legs stopped. And that was that. They dragged the remains out of the trailer, burying them behind the farm buildings in the dark, working by torchlight. When the hole was filled and the ground stamped flat, Getty stuck his spade in the earth, leaning on it, and said, "Don't bring any more animals down that damned road." My father explained that he still had one more trip. Geddes gave him a look and said, "My father used to haulage sheep before me, and his father before him. Nobody in my family drives after dark on the moor road, and I'd suggest you arrive at the same policy." He picked up his spade and walked away. My father drove home. He didn't sleep well that night. In fact, he first stayed in the kitchen in the dark with a cup of tea, sort of just listening to the house. He tried to find a way to make what he had seen fit into a normal world, but he failed to do so. The days after the third trip were the part of the story my father told with the least detail. I think this was not because nothing happened, but because what happened was personal. And even on his deathbed, there were things he didn't want to hand down to his son. He said he felt different, that food had lost its familiar taste. Even the reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed delayed or lagged by the smallest fraction of a second, but he could feel it. And he had dreams every night. The moor road, footsteps behind him, the walk that didn't end, and every morning, the boots were by the door with fresh peat on the soles. My mother noticed. She was not an easily frightened woman, but my father said she had begun watching him with a quality of attention associated with waiting rooms. Patient, alert, braced for any kind of news. One evening she told him he smelled different. He asked what she meant. She said she could not describe it, except that it wasn't him. The smell of his very skin had changed, and she looked afraid, likely because my father wasn't sick. And if he was, that would be treatable. This wasn't. Drummond eventually called. One more trip, the final batch. 15 ewes, finish the contract, finish the drove, and be done. My father said yes. Drummond's warning was the last thing my father heard before he pulled out of the farm track onto the B road for the final time. They'd loaded the 15 ewes in near silence, working quickly in the afternoon light, and as my father climbed into the cab, Drummond put his hand on the doorframe, and he held it there so that the door couldn't close. He looked my father dead in the eye, and he said, "Don't stop. Whatever you see on that road, don't stop the truck. If it stalls, you stay in the cab. Do not put your feet on that road after dark." My father asked what would happen if he did. Drummond took his hand off the doorframe and said, "Then you'll join the drove." He stepped back, and my father closed the door. That was the last time the two men spoke. It was 3:30 when he reached the B road. Sunset was at 4:30. 12 miles at 45 would take 16 minutes. He would be off the moor and through the cattle grid with daylight to spare. My father said he felt something close to optimism as he turned onto the single track, which tells you how far his calibration had shifted over the preceding weeks. That the prospect of driving a road that had mutilated livestock and put living eyes in a dead man's face could produce anything resembling relief. But he had daylight, and he had speed, and he had an engine that had never let him down. In 16 minutes, it should be over. The moor opened up on either side as the road climbed away from the glen. Brown peat, gray sky, hills on the horizon just visible through a thin haze. He set his speed at 45 and watched the odometer and drove. At mile 3, the sky changed. The overcast, which had been a uniform gray sheet all day, thickened and dropped. This man had driven through highland squalls and hill fog, even through horizontal rain so bad it reduced visibility to the length of the bonnet. But this was strange. The light simply left. No fade whatsoever. The light was simply removed. He checked his watch. 10 to 4. The sunset should not have been for another 40 minutes. The dark had come early, and it came all at once. There was nothing natural about this. He pressed his accelerator. The engine responded, but the truck felt heavy suddenly, sluggish, laboring, like it was having trouble pulling the additional weight of the trailer now. The temperature gauge, which normally sat comfortably in the middle third of its range, began to climb. He was doing 45 by the speedometer, but the sensation of speed was wrong too. The road ahead unspooled in his headlights at a pace that felt closer to 30. Mile 6. The halfway point on a 12-mile road, except by now he had no faith that that road was 12 miles. He drove and he watched the odometer count, and he kept his hands tight on the wheel. The sheep in the trailer stayed silent. He had been listening for them since the start of the drive, but he'd heard nothing. Over a dozen animals standing in a metal box in a moving vehicle eventually produced some sound, but these were producing nothing. It had been so completely quiet behind him that if he hadn't loaded them himself an hour earlier, he could have believed that the trailer was empty. Mile 9. No cattle grid. The moor road continued ahead of him, straight and featureless, the headlights reaching maybe 80 yards before the dark swallowed them. The temperature gauge was nudging the red. The engine note had changed from the steady diesel thrum that he knew as well as his heartbeat to something strained and arrhythmic, a machine working against a resistance which it was not designed for. He checked the wing mirror on the driver's side. A habit of his. A haulier does this every few minutes without thinking about it. There, in the red wash of the taillights, at the furthest edge of what the glow could reach, there were shapes on the road behind him. They were low and pale, moving in a loose formation that spread across the width of the road and the verges on either side. Sheep. There were sheep on the road behind his trailer, following him across the moor, and there were far more of them than the 15 he was carrying. He could see dozens. They filled the road from edge to edge and extended back beyond the reach of his taillights into a darkness that could have contained any number more. They were walking at the same pace as his truck, keeping a steady distance, and even in the dim red light and the small shaking rectangle of the wing mirror, he could see that they were not normal. Like that figure from before, they moved stiffly and uniformly, every animal moving in the same rhythm, legs working in lockstep that normal sheep would never do. Some of them were even walking on legs that were bent oddly, which would make it impossible for a living animal to stand on, let alone move with. One near the front of the flock, where the tail light was strongest, had its head hanging sideways from a clearly broken neck. The skull was resting against its own shoulder, and it walked the same steady pace as the rest. Their wool was dark and matted, with something that looked like mud but wasn't, and the ones closest to the light had a quality to their bodies that my father struggled to articulate that I will try to convey as precisely as I can. They looked compressed, flattened, as though they had been subject to enormous pressure that had pushed them into a denser version of themselves, the way peat pushes everything into a tighter, darker, more preserved form. My father faced forward and put his foot down. The engine screamed, the speedometer read 50, but that road was not meant for 50. The truck shuddered and swayed, and he held the wheel with both hands, determined to keep driving, due to what Drummond had told him, and because looking in that mirror again was something that he could not bring himself to do. Mile 14. There was no cattle grid still. The road should have ended 2 miles ago by any honest measurement, and it had not ended. The engine temperature was in the red, and the needle was still climbing. My father could smell hot metal and coolant, and he knew that the truck was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. It died at mile 15. Like a dying man's pulse, the engine stopped. Mid-beat, total, without the courtesy of a gradual failure. The truck rolled forward on its remaining momentum, slowing, and came to a rest on the empty road, with the headlights dimming to amber on battery power, and the dark closing in from every direction like water filling a hole. He sat in the cab. He did not try the ignition. He knew the engine was gone, and he understood that turning the key would drain the battery faster, and the headlights were the only thing between him and absolute darkness. He wanted them for as long as they would last. The cab was cooling rapidly. The heater had died with the engine, and the November cold came in through the glass and the floor and the doors. Yet underneath that cold was the other cold, the one he'd felt on the moor road from the first trip. Wet and organic, carrying the smell of deep peat, the smell of ground full of dead things. In the wing mirror, the flock had stopped. They stood on the road behind the trailer in a dense, still mass, and in the fading taillight, they almost looked like ordinary sheep if you kept your focus soft and did not look too closely. My father did not examine them closely either. He glanced once, then he faced forward, placing his hands on the wheel as he waited. The flock parted. He heard that part rather than saw it. The sound of hooves on tarmac shifting to either side, pressing to the verges to open a path through their center. And through that center, at a pace that matched the mechanical rhythm of the flock's walking, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy steps, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound underneath, as though this new figure was leaving a trail on the road surface. The footsteps passed along the left side of the trailer, close enough that my father could hear the brush of the long coat against the metal sidewall. And then they were alongside the truck. Then they were alongside the cab, and then they stopped outside the driver's door. My father didn't look. He stared through the windshield at the last pale cone of his failing headlights on the empty road ahead. He kept his hands on the wheel, and he didn't turn his head. He could hear it, though. Hear it standing there inches from the glass, the sound of its breathing thin and papery. Beneath the breathing, he could hear other smaller sounds. The faint creak of the weight across its shoulders shifting, the slow drip of something landing on the tarmac below, the soft, wet contact of the dead sheep's hooves swaying against the figure's chest. And it stood there for so long. But my father didn't count. He said that time lost its structure, because when you're in a situation like that, time loses its meaning. The only way he knew time was truly passing was the fact that the headlights were still getting dimmer, and that the cold was getting deeper. He gripped the wheel, and he did not look at it. He did not speak to it. He refused to move. Suddenly, the glass made a sound, a high and thin sound, like something hard being drawn down a smooth surface. My father kept his eyes forward, but he could see it in his peripheral vision. The movement on the driver's side window, the dark shape at the glass. The sound continued, a slow, downward stroke, from the top of the window to the bottom. Then another, parallel to the first, and another. 4 strokes altogether, 4 lines or grooves being inscribed into the exterior of the glass by something that was not a fingernail, and was not a tool, and was, as far as my father's peripheral vision could tell, the tip of a bare, dark, and hardened finger. The sound stopped. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, but then the footsteps resumed, moving past the cab, past the bonnet, and now onto the road ahead. The dragging sound went with it, and the flock on the verges began to move, falling in line behind the figure. The whole procession, the shepherd and his dead drove, walked north along the moor road until the sound of their passage faded and the night was silent my father was alone. He waited, maybe 5 minutes. He could not have waited longer because his body was shaking with a violence that made it difficult to keep his hands on the wheel, and the cold had gotten into him, touching his very core. He turned the key, and the engine started right away, turning over on the first attempt with a healthy, steady note. It was like the dang thing had never stopped. The headlights brightened, the temperature gauge sat in the middle of its range, and the cab began to warm up. He put the truck in gear and drove. The cattle grid appeared less than 2 miles later, exactly where the map said it should be, and he crossed it, and the road dropped into the glen, and the moor was behind him. He did not look back. At the Geddes farm, the farmer had agreed to receive this final batch despite what he'd said before. My father never explained how that arrangement had been made. They opened the trailer. 14 sheep came out, healthy, uninjured, and calm. 14, not 15. The trailer was sealed, bolted from the outside. There was no gap or breach anywhere in its construction, nowhere for a 60-kilogram animal to leave through. 14 sheep walked into the pen, and the 15th simply did not exist. There was no body, no blood, no wool, and no hoofprint. There was no indication that a 15th animal had ever been in the trailer at all. Geddes counted twice, so did my father. 14. Geddes looked at my father across the pen gate, and my father looked back. Geddes took out his delivery book, signed the receipt for 15, and put the book away. He closed the pen and walked toward his house without turning around. My father drove home to Bewley in the dark with the heater on full and the radio playing. His hands were steady on the wheel and his mind was blank. He parked outside his house and sat in the cab for a while before finally going inside. He didn't check the trailer. He never checked that trailer again. He never drove that moor road again either. The contract was finished. Drummond never called, and my father never inquired. He learned years later and secondhand that Drummond had been found dead on the moor road in the spring of 1979. They found him sitting upright against a fence post with his crook across his lap, dead of exposure on a night when the temperature had not dropped below 7 degrees. The man who told my father about this said Drummond looked like he had been sitting there for a long time, though the pathologist report put the death at only a few hours before the body was found. My father received this information, said nothing, and changed the subject. Those changes my father dealt with, well, they faded. The dreams stopped within a month or so. The peat mud stopped appearing on his boots. The strange thing about his reflection even settled. My mother stopped watching him, and the smell she had noticed went away. By the time I was born in February of 1973, my father was, by all external measures, the same man he'd been before the contract. He went back to work. He hauled livestock for another 28 years, and he never spoke about what happened, never drove that road. But he was a different man. But because I grew up inside that difference, I wasn't able to name it myself. But I knew that he flinched at dead animals on the roadside. Not the typical grimace that you might make, but a full-body recoil, a jerk of the head away, as though the sight was physically painful. He wouldn't walk on unpaved ground after dark, which in the rural highlands is a significant constraint, and if circumstances forced it, he moved with a rigid, mechanical haste that I now recognize as a man trying to spend as little time as possible with his feet on open earth. He kept the radio on every waking hour in every room he occupied, a low and continuous murmur of voices and music that didn't really serve an entertainment purpose. He really didn't listen to it himself. It was just sound to fill the quiet, made him feel less alone. A few years after he died, I flew out to visit my mom, and I went to look at the truck. The Bedford was still in the barn where he'd parked it after his last job, covered in dust and pigeon droppings, but structurally intact. I opened the cab door and sat in the driver's seat. I mean, my father had spent more hours in that seat than in any chair in our house. There was something of him still in the worn vinyl, in the position of the mirrors, and the faint smell of diesel and livestock. I looked at the driver's side window. The scratches were still there. 4 vertical lines scored into the exterior surface, running from the top to the bottom, deep enough to catch a fingernail when I ran my hand across them on the outside. These weren't cracks. They weren't random marks of road debris or scraped branches. They were a warning, and they were proof that my dad's story was more true than I liked to believe. I feel like roads can be haunted like houses can be haunted, but one seems far worse. If you're trapped in a haunted house, you cover your head, you ignore the ghosts, and you wait for dawn. But a haunted road, well, you're at the mercy of the infinite darkness, my friend, and whatever lurks within it. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can send me your scary work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit. You can also find this show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the YouTube channel, Darkness Prevails. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon.
Hi.
Wendy's has the best nuggets, okay? I'm sorry, you can Chick-fil Cope all you want, but I'm right. Oh, why am I talking about Wendy's? Well, tonight we have a very long and horrifying story of a Wendy's haunted by a very creepy car and its 2 occupants, plus some other stories featuring extremely unsettling rules you should never break, or else, and spirits with unknown and often creepy motives. These are Tales from the Break Room. Give us a follow and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That would be very handsome of you. Thank you. The Severed Head, from William P. 85. I want to tell you something that happened to me several years ago, like 10 years ago or more maybe. I was 17 at that time. It was my first serious job as a waiter in a restaurant in Mexico City, or a place close to it. And the truth is, I had no experience at all. Nevertheless, they gave me the opportunity because my uncle had worked there for many years before, and they still remembered him fondly, even though he no longer lived in the city at the time. I totally understood. My uncle is a cool guy. As it usually happens with your first job, when you're a teenager or young adult, the first few days were exciting. Learning how to carry trays, wait on tables, get along with customers, especially with difficult ones or Karens, and move quickly through the aisles without bumping into anything or anyone. However, there were also tough days. I usually left work very late at night, with the smell of food permeating my clothes and my feet and back aching from spending so many hours on my feet. That night started out like any other, very busy with lots of customers, until all of them left and we finally managed to close the place for the night. The guy who normally gave me rides every night was resting, or I think it was his day off, so I had to go out alone. There was no one left outside at the time. The boulevard that led to my bus stop was almost empty, just the occasional car passing by, which felt a little creepy to me, to be honest. As soon as I started walking, I heard something strange. It was like a murmur, as if someone had asked for help. I stopped, looking around, but I couldn't see anyone. Not a soul. There was no wind either. I looked through the bushes that grew in the vacant lot next to the boulevard. They were a little tall, but I swore I'd heard a voice. Although it seemed like there was nothing there, I continued walking. But now my nerves were on edge, and my bladder was about to betray me. The silence of the street seemed more terrifying than usual. as if something or someone had extinguished all the noises coming from afar. I reached the pedestrian bridge and began to climb the stairs. It was there that I heard that strange noise again. It was a long, muffled moan, as if someone was in pain, and it came from under the bridge. I stopped halfway down the stairs and I looked down. What I'm gonna say is very terrifying. It's horrible, frightening, and you should be warned that this is not for the faint of heart. But do understand that I am sure that this is what I saw. Down in the street was a severed human head. Yes, a head. It did not have a body, just the head lying on the asphalt as if someone had just left it there. And the most terrifying thing was that it seemed to move, as if it was trying to talk to me. I realized those moans had been coming from it. I did not know how to react. I felt my legs go numb, as if fear would not let me move. But that only lasted a few seconds, since I almost immediately ran away from that cursed place. I ran like never before in my life. I didn't even wait at the stop for my bus to arrive. I ran the 2 kilometers that I had to go to get home. I ran with my heart about to jump out of my chest. I made that classic horror movie mistake of looking back, and I saw the mouth of that head moving like it was still trying to talk to me. I arrived, soaked in sweat, trembling, and that night I could not sleep a wink. I had nightmares because of what I'd seen. Afterwards, every time I left the restaurant late, I preferred to call an Uber, even if it meant spending half of what I'd earned that day, just so I would not have to walk down that boulevard alone again. I quit my job soon after, but I will never forget what I saw that night. Years later, when my uncle came to visit the city, it came up that I had also worked at the same restaurant as him. Of course, he asked about some of his old friends, and he began to tell me some of his stories. He laughed, and then suddenly became very serious, and he told me that the only bad thing he had experienced during his time there was what had happened to the brother of one of the guys from the restaurant. One afternoon, after giving him a ride home on his motorcycle, the man crashed a few meters from the spot. An acquaintance from a stall set up close to the bridge ran to notify him immediately, and the poor brother went out desperately to look for him, to see what had happened. When he arrived, he found the most horrible scene of his life. His brother had been decapitated somehow, and this was terrifying for everyone involved. My uncle told me that they never fully recovered from it. I didn't know what to say to this. I felt a strange cold in my stomach, because I understood instantly that what I'd seen that night on the bridge was real. It had not been my imagination, and it had been no dream. It was a ghost, a last scream trapped in that place. And to this day, although I no longer live nearby, I know that I would never dare walk by there at night again. Night shift at Wendy's. From Dean. My Wendy's had its lobby open until midnight. After that, we'd remain open for another few hours, all until 3 in the morning, functioning exclusively as a drive-thru. I worked there for about 7 months, following the completion of a college degree. Ironic, I know, taking primarily night shifts. The night shift itself isn't bad, but it does attract a different demographic than usual. High school and college-age kids, drunk or otherwise intoxicated, were our main patrons, occasionally sprinkled in with families finishing up incredibly late road trips, as our location was near an interstate on-ramp. I only had one experience that I'd describe as strange. I mean, we've had freaky people show up, sure, but this evening was something special. An important note: at drive-thru speakers we can hear a lot. The microphones are tuned that way, so as to clearly and cleanly pick up a customer's voice. But with that, they also feed us everything from the gossiping of people in the back seat, to what you're playing on the radio, to crying children, to the sounds your idling engine makes. Basically, everything. And even further, at most locations nowadays, we also have video cameras attached. The one at my Wendy's was mounted well above the food menu, so it mostly just showed us the make and model of cars. It was helpful in the sense that it tracked motion and would give us an additional ping when a vehicle was detected, and also enabled us to better identify which order was going where in times of rush. Now that you know these details, I can recount my strange and unsettling experience. I think I clocked in around 10:30 p.m. We had very split duties in the sense that people would be rotated around during their shift, for example from front counter to drive-thru, which I appreciated to break the monotony. Anyway, I worked front counter for about 90 minutes, until we closed up the restaurant lobby. I remember this well, because I did have to get a particularly drunk older gentleman out with a very stern tone, as he was hovering around. I remember him spitting at me and dropping an empty can of seltzer before leaving, and I closed the door he exited out of with a very satisfying deadbolt click. Following that, I rotated myself over to the drive-thru. There were 3 other employees working alongside me. I believe 2 cooks and someone on janitorial. Anyway, time progresses pretty slow as I worked through a grand total of maybe 11 cars in half an hour. That was fairly status quo. So I'm hanging out near the pay window, which of course preceded the serve window. It might sound strange, but with the low volume of customers, I was pretty much serving both windows by myself. Not that I minded. I think I was on my phone at the time, just hanging out, when I suddenly looked up at the terribly low-quality monitor mounted above my head. That's when I see a car, directly at the ordering speaker. I find this strange because we didn't get a ping, at least not through my headset. I didn't hear a voice either, and the indicator light embedded on the camera display wasn't blinking, as if it detected nothing. Looking at the vehicle, it was fairly obvious it was a Crown Victoria, a Ford sedan that ended production back in 2011. Black, long, with simple curvature. Most Americans identify them very easily, as they were by far the most common cop car model for a long time. This one was unmarked, though. No lights or sirens, just black. A civilian, I assumed. So I pull my microphone down and say my greeting spiel, asking them what they'd like to order. And I just get silence. No noise of any kind. I waited for 10 or so seconds, expecting the swoosh of an automatic window, only to get nothing. It was then that I noticed, bizarrely, I couldn't hear any engine noise. In fact, I could plainly pick up on ambient night wind, but no noises from the vehicle or anyone inside it. Keep in mind, albeit smaller than what you find in a Mustang, these Crown Victorias did have V8 gasoline engines. Typically, the speaker would pick up that kind of thing as they sat idle. But no, I heard and got nothing. So I checked the camera again, and the polling timestamp on the video feed is up to date, so I know it hadn't frozen. Since I was serving the drive-thru previously, I also know that I hadn't seen that vehicle come through. But it's there, and live on the camera, albeit unresponsive. So I open my pay window, and I lean out, trying to see the vehicle in better resolution than what the little sensor camera offered. Only, as I lean out, I notice that there's nothing there. No car whatsoever. And so I pull my head back in and check the camera. But it's blank. Empty. The large black car that was absolutely there a second ago is now gone. Obviously, I'm a little weirded out. The way the drive-thru flowed, There's no way a vehicle could have left without driving by my window, unless it reversed out. And I'm not sure why they would have done that, as the street exit was so close. Even if they decided they didn't want anything, they could have easily driven by. But they didn't do that. They were just gone. Of course, I just assumed they'd backed out, and I missed them. I thought it strange, but carried on with my evening. I served maybe 2 more cars before deciding to quickly run to the restroom. When I tried the door to the employee restroom, it was locked, and I assumed the tiny toilet was either in use or being cleaned. So I headed instead to the lobby to use one of the public ones. Again, remember, it was probably 12:45 or so I expected no one to be in there. I'd only ever used the public washrooms during this drive-through only time. I pass by the counter facing into the lobby on my way, and as I do, I notice a figure. I stop and I look closely. At a table on a raised platform with 4 or so other tables, right in the corner of the restaurant, there is a man. He's sitting there neatly, slim, white, older, bald as far as I could tell. He's wearing a suit, like Fed style, black. And so I say, "Sir, we're closed right now," thinking I'd managed to leave a door unlocked, and he just wandered on in. But he ignores me. There's no indication that he heard me at all. He doesn't so much as move. Nothing is on the table. He's just staring straight ahead. So I move away from the counter and out the employee door leading into the lobby, preparing to ask him to leave. Just as I exit the door, legitimately seconds after seeing him, I look again, only to find his seat now empty. There's no sign of anyone at all. I look around, the raised area and the one below, out the windows. Heck, I even check under the tables, but nobody is there at all. As I go to peer out the doors and see if he left hurriedly, I confirm all the doors are actually locked. At this point, I feel a little nervous. I don't think I related the man to that car at the time, but even so, I just wasn't in the right headspace. It was really strange. He had 100% been there a moment before. But I carry on anyway. I use the restroom and return to my post. Now, are you familiar with the sound that cicadas or cicadas make? Like that low hummy chirp? As I have the headset on, only a few minutes after getting back, I begin to hear it. It's loud and droning. It wasn't unheard of for bugs to be attracted to our bright and glowing food menus at night, but this sounded like a swarm of big winged insects. Or at least, that's my closest approximation. Whatever it was, it sounded right next to the microphone. I peer at the camera, but I see nothing. The sound continues anyway. It gets louder and louder and louder. It really is quite ridiculous. I'd think the headset was malfunctioning if it wasn't for the occasional bleat and drop in sound, as if it really was a chaotic and organic swarm of bugs. But still, there's nothing on the camera, and it grows at a steady rate. I'm about to take the headset off until it absolutely screeches. It's no longer a bug-like noise, but just raw nail-on-chalkboard style feedback. At the same time, the drive-through camera display grows bright. Ridiculously bright, like someone is shining a dang sun into the camera. Completely bright white, with the timestamp still rolling properly. So I rip the headset off, take a few paces around, and watch as the light vanishes from the display. It doesn't dissipate and it doesn't fade. It's just completely gone, as if whatever had been emitting it had been wiped. I check my headset again. No weird noise. I think I had rationalized it at the time as some kind of low-flying plane that had its light angled directly into our drive-through camera. Obviously, that makes no sense, but it's what I rolled with. Now, I know what you're thinking. I should tell my coworkers about the weird happenings. And even though I didn't really know any of them, as we all came from different backgrounds and rarely socialized, I did want to at least see if they had anything weird happen to them that night. I went into the kitchen, and I found one of our cooks. He looked incredibly bored. Now, I get his attention, and I'm about to attempt to explain what had just happened, when another employee, the janitorial one I'd mentioned, comes in and says my name. I ask what he wants, and he says, since I have the headset, am I not going to take care of the car over in the drive-thru? Now, I didn't get a ping. I didn't hear a thing. But he says he had just dropped garbage out in the dumpster, and he saw a car waiting at the ordering speaker. So I rush back to my station, unable to tell my tale, because I'm giving our welcome greeting as I move. I finish right as I get to my window, though, and as I do, I look up at the display. And the vehicle that was there, the one my coworker had seen, was that black Crown Victoria. Of course, they don't answer me. There's no noise whatsoever. The car just sits there on my display still. I realize then that its headlights are not on. That wasn't something I'd noticed the first time, but the car is just dark, only the big mass of silhouetted steel visible, with no lights emitting. There's no idle noise in my headset, so I stay watching it, not taking my eyes off the thing, and I raise my voice and call my coworker's name. Luckily, he hears me, and I quickly ask him to go outside and check if there's a car waiting in the drive-thru. He's confused and asks me if there's something wrong with the camera. I don't answer. Instead, I'm intently watching this car on the display. I didn't want to look away, lest it disappear again. I tell him once more, go out and look, and he does. The strangest clip I've ever seen on that camera then plays out. I hear the outside door to the drive-thru swing open as it's incredibly near my window. I see my coworker pass by, walking towards where the vehicle would be, and then he comes into view on the camera. I see him approach the car, directly in front of it, and then, I kid you not, I watch him walk into it, like directly through the grille and into the engine compartment. He stands there for a second, looking as if he'd sunk into the front of the vehicle itself and was waiting around in it. And then I watch as he keels over, almost lowering his head and upper body into where the car is on my screen, before he vomits loudly. Something I hear both over my headset and out the still closed window I was sitting behind. Right away, I rush out, taking the same door he did, and as I look down the narrow strip of road, I see no car at all, unlike what was clearly displayed on the camera. Instead, my coworker is sick, nearly on his knees, and vomits again. I rush over, asking if he's all right, and he's shaky. I can see sweat running down his forehead in the dim illumination of the drive-thru. He says he suddenly feels sick, like he got food poisoning, and so I help him inside. I sit him down and pour him a ginger ale from our drink fountain, which he thanks me for. And once he seems more collected, I ask him if there was any car outside, not mentioning the fact that I had just watched him wade into a big black sedan, his body somehow sharing the same space as the car. He says no, that there was no car out there at all. And then, as a follow-up, I ask him what the car he'd seen idling out there moments prior actually looked like. Very plain, he told me, in so many words, that he had seen the same black Crown Victoria. At this point, I am beyond freaked out. Even if my camera was just misbehaving, showing a car that wasn't there for whatever reason, I hadn't so much as uttered the model of it to anyone else. The fact that he had seen it himself, only when he took out the trash, was so strange. Not as strange as the fact that he had thrown up and gotten the shakes from walking through whatever that thing on my camera was. I had and still have no idea what that was. I don't tell him any of this, though. I mean, I would sound crazy, right? And before you ask, no, I can't rewind footage on my camera. The drive-through camera and the rest of the CCTV around the place recorded to a server, or whatever infrastructure only high-level employees had access to. So I return to my post and patiently sit. I'm almost ecstatic when a normal car comes by and places an order for a Baconator, or whatever it actually was. A few minutes after that's done, though, I hear a very loud, aggressive yell. Not through my headset, but instead coming from the lobby. I go out and I look. Keep in mind, the lobby is where my coworker who had just gotten sick and encountered the ghost car was sitting, still sipping his ginger ale. As I come out and ask what's up, I see him on 2 feet looking over across the restaurant to a corner. Immediately, I notice he's staring at the same corner in which I'd seen the suited man from before. My nerves certainly aren't soothed as he goes on to describe a similar sight. He said he was sitting there, drinking his soda, when he noticed a man in a dark suit sitting in the corner, identifying the same chair I did. He got up then, asking what the customer was doing inside the lobby, as it was well past 1 a.m. He says he got close enough to make out how old the guy was, remarking he was bald and light-skinned. Then he describes the man getting up, looking at him, and opening his mouth. Keep in mind this coworker of mine is emotional as he describes this. Anyway, instead of speaking, this man just kind of opened his mouth into a large circular gape, and as disgusting as it sounds, he said as the man's mouth opened, out came these giant, loud, flying bugs. I looked at him shocked. Immediately, I began saying I'd seen the same guy about an hour ago, and we confirm he looked exactly the same between the two of our stories. But then I ask about the bugs in detail, and all he can tell me, between colorful words and visible emotion, is that they were loud and just beamed at him. Then he specifies that he wasn't lying, not that I thought he was, and then he claims to have proof. I ask what he meant, and he points at the floor. And against the matte granite color of the tiles, there is an insect. I couldn't make it out because it was almost the same color as the floor, but it was there. It was a fat, rotund thing, huge, mind you, for a bug, about the size of my AirPods case, or a little bigger. The same kind of volume, too, like it was thick. At the time, Google Lens wasn't prevalent as it is today, so I couldn't take a photo and look it up. So I simply couldn't identify it. However, I do know that it was disgusting. He reiterates that a swarm of those things had come out of the suited man's mouth. Then he stomps on it. So we don't really know what to do. As bonded as we were over seeing the weird guy, I don't bring up the car. His English wasn't amazing, and I didn't know how to communicate the fact that I had seen him step inside the car without sounding absurd, so I didn't. Promptly, he tells me he's leaving for the night, that the place was sick, whatever that meant, and that he doubted he would ever be back. Not that it matters, but he was probably only 18 or so. Anyway, he leaves. I don't think he told the cooks, because again, no one really knew each other that well. I go back to my window. This is where things pick up. The cycle, if I can call it that, repeats itself. First, I serve an ordinary car. Great. Fine and dandy. And then, that darned Crown Victoria shows up on the camera. And it sits there. And it waits. I lean out my window to check if it's really there. And of course, it isn't. As soon as I come back in, it's gone from the monitor. Not so long later, my screen gets flashed again with blinding light. and along comes that same disgusting insectoid swarming noise. Another minute later, they pass. After the first repeat, I go tell the kitchen staff. These people are much older than me, one of them being my default manager, as we didn't have a manager in the skeleton crew early morning setup. And I don't want to look crazy, but I still mention that weird stuff is happening to my camera setup. I say that a freaky car keeps showing up, never ordering anything, and I leave it at that. They tell me that if a car is occupying the drive-thru without ordering, I should just ask them to leave. If they don't, at that point, I can call the police. I thank them. Of course, it happens again. Not so long after, either. It showed up, not rolled up or drove up, but again just appeared on my camera. I greeted it, or them, whatever, and they said nothing. And then I lean out and see nothing, and then the buzzing and lights come. Now, it might sound absurd, but it almost normalized. It became trivial. I knew how to deal with it. Maybe I should have gone home. I'm sure a lot of you would have in this situation. But I didn't. I sat there and dealt with it, because I wanted my money. My rationale then became that some guy was messing with me somehow, doing imperceptibly fast laps around my Wendy's, then somehow flashing a blinding light, playing absurd noises at my speaker in between his appearances. I really tried to feed myself this. Like, I knew something weird was going on, but I didn't care, or I didn't want to believe or acknowledge it. I just wanted to finish my shift and go home. Somehow, I knew if I left early, that would just validate the creepy car more. And so I didn't. I persisted. And so did it. Maybe 6 cycles went by of the same darned thing. I stopped greeting it entirely. It made no difference to me. Oh, and in case you were wondering, no, there weren't any plates on the car. At least, none that I could see through my camera. No means of identifying it any further than make and model. Actually, it could have been a Grand Marquis or one of the other handful of cars that share the chassis. I really have no idea what exact car it was, as all I saw of it was that ridiculously low-quality drive-thru image. At the same time, the thought of the suited man in the lobby was eating at me. Like, my encounter was creepy, sure, but that gross, disgusting bug, and my coworker's account of a swarm of them pouring out of the man's mouth, that's just terrifying. So no, I don't go out there. I have no reason to, and I certainly have no desire to. I just keep serving the occasional real car and keep ripping off my headset as that noise comes by the speaker. I think maybe close to 2:15, it dies down, like completely. No car of any kind, spooky or otherwise, comes through, and so I take another bathroom break. To my dismay, the employee washroom still won't open. Realizing I have to head back into the lobby and use the public one, I get a little freaked out. But I promise myself, if I so much as see a glimpse of that man, I'll just scream and bring all the kitchen staff out. I pass by the counter and I see no one. I'm a little relieved, until I open the door. When I do, there's this most absurd feeling of a chill. Now, keep in mind the counter I had just passed by was open to the lobby. If it was cold in there, I would have felt it. But no, it only hits when I cross that door threshold. It's a ridiculous, burning and piercing cold, too. Like winter in Chicago while you're wearing short sleeves kind of cold. I look around and back at the same table. This time, I see a woman. Now, trying to describe her is near futile, as I turned around and booked it back inside and towards the kitchen so quickly, but to the best of my knowledge, she was old. I recall gray hair. Her clothes, I don't know, black maybe. But I sprint into the kitchen, almost knocking someone over, telling them some weirdo was in the lobby. They both come with me. As we break into it, she's gone. Just gone. Nothing there. But the air, mind you, was still cold as ice. They both are wondering why too, and then get annoyed with me for bringing them out for no reason. So I apologize, feigning ignorance and silliness, before I quickly use that restroom and head back in with them. I'm now counting down the minutes until I can leave. At that point, I don't know where my rationale was. I think my logic center just went to sleep. There were maybe 1 or 2 cars over the next 30 minutes. Yes, real cars too. I serve them as usual. A little while later, I kid you not, it's 2:58. I'm so close to being able to leave when my headset pings. The camera indicator goes off, and on the camera, you guessed it, there was that black Crown Victoria. Only this time, it's slinking up. It's moving, driving, and it has headlights on. So I hold my breath. I mean, the car is common enough, right? Maybe this time it was just a real and normal person. I greet them, and in very concise English, a man orders 2 plain hamburgers. That's quite literally what he said. So I mark them up as our junior hamburger items and wait. The car keeps rolling, and it arrives at my window. Their window is up, total dark tint in the front, which I am pretty sure was illegal in my state, but yeah. The window rolls down, and I'm greeted by the exact man I saw in the lobby the first time. The one my coworker saw too, dressed in a suit. He's old, probably in his 70s, and bald. Next to him is this woman of equivalent age, dressed like she's about to go to a funeral. Whether or not she was the same one from the lobby from before, I could not be sure, as I had bolted so fast before. But naturally, I assumed it was. I look at them, dumbfounded, and he just hands me a $20 bill. He looks at me for a really long couple of seconds before the window rolls up. As it did, though, I swear inside the cabin of the car, I could see the occasional fat little bug zip back and forth as if flying around. The woman staring forward plainly, and the man staring at me. He didn't let me hand him his $16 or so of change. I'm literally dumbfounded and kind of shaky. Once I pick up the already finished bag from the kitchen's food slide, I take it over to the third window. But now the car is gone. They weren't waiting for their order, nor their change. The vehicle is just gone. I don't really know how to explain all of it, or what it meant if it meant anything. And yeah, I pocketed that otherworldly change, sue me, and I quit pretty soon after that, just because I got a better job with normal full-time hours. I still get a little freaked out anytime I see a car of that platform in black though. Maybe someone out there might know more, if this is like some sort of urban legend I stumbled upon or something. But that's all I've got. The Late Night Terror from Lindo. Firstly, let me explain a few things. Here in South Africa, since the old days dating back to the 60s, there is a belief that there is an owner or ruler of certain places, such as big rivers or swamps. Most of these said owners are not humans, but creatures. And not just any creatures. It might be a big, dangerous snake, or any mythical creature you could think of, like mermaids or mermen and so on. It is believed that you cannot simply enter as you please at someone's territory. Over the years, there were incidents where people lost their lives at said places. So I also grew up knowing that we don't go swimming in some lakes, and there are people who say they saw these entities. These entities can take human forms as well to lure people where they shouldn't be. This story I'm sharing happened to my uncle. To be clear, it didn't happen at any big lake or river, but at a certain train station. At that train station, there was an entity who was believed to be looking after the station. Most people believed that the entity was the owner of the station. He used to work at a big train station, and that station had a certain rule. That is, at exactly 23:55, everyone must clear the station. Whether you're a security guard or you are a cleaner waiting for a train, all personnel must remain indoors until 0:15. It was said that the owner of the land the station was located on was passing by during this time. That rule must be followed, no matter what. He remembers it clearly. Back in 1994, still new to the job, his supervisor told him on his first day that there was a rule he must follow. At first, it may sound weird, but he would understand in the future if he still worked there. So yeah, he followed the rule as he was instructed. Nothing odd happened the first few weeks. This rule of remaining indoors every 23:55 to 0:15 every day did not sit well with him. So after he'd settled in at his new job as a night shift security guard, now knowing everyone's routine and everyone's business, he started digging for information. First was the cleaning crew. He asked, "I don't mean to be nosy and stuff, but does anyone care to tell me what's with the 11:55 rule?" That's what everyone called it, the 11:55 rule. But no one gave an answer. They just said, "Man, just follow the rule. We're just here to work, nothing more. Plus, we know nothing. We joined the company and the rule was already here when we got here." Even George, the old man who had been working at the train station for 25 years, told him to mind his business and just focus on his work. That made him want to dig even deeper. Eventually, he gave up on the idea. Then, one evening, curiosity got the better of him. He sat outside with his armchair and flashlight in hand. When the clock hit 23:45, everyone started to go back inside. But he just sat there, watching everyone go in. Some tried to talk him into going inside. But as he sat there, something felt off. Have you ever had the feeling that something wasn't normal, and your gut told you to run, but you chose to ignore it? Yeah, he had that feeling, but he ignored it. At exactly 23:50, the atmosphere changed. He felt a chill down his spine and something told him, "On your left, buddy." He looked slowly to his left, and he could only mutter, "Sweet Mother of Jesus." Yes, he saw it. Or rather, him. A man adorned in a full formal black suit, with a long coat reaching down to his knees, wearing a top hat. That's not the scary part, though. The man was not walking. Instead, he was floating in the air, 1 meter above the ground. He was going straight, but when he came into view, 10 feet from where my uncle was seated, he stopped for a few seconds. He then turned to face him. My uncle was known to be the brave one in his family, but the man adorned in full black, whose face he could not see, made him wet himself. On top of that, he was shaking like someone had poured ice water all over him. The man stood there facing him for what felt like ages, but was only about 10 seconds. Then, he continued on his way. After that encounter, my uncle resigned. He never took any more night shift jobs again. And the worst thing is, he doesn't feel okay telling anyone the story if it's nighttime, because every time he tells it, he feels like the man is somewhere close, watching him. Now, this following story was told to me by my mother. She was in her early teens when she had her encounter. I was 16 years old when one afternoon one of my friends, her name was Maria, a kind and friendly soul who loved church with all her heart, invited me to go with her family to attend a night gathering at their church. As naughty as I was, since I knew my mother wouldn't agree, I snuck out around 7 p.m. and ran to Maria's house, already dressed for church. When I got there around 7:30, we watched TV until around 10:30. That's when we left for the gathering, and it wasn't held at the main branch. It was held at a different branch, 3.5 hours of walking away. We walked, midnight hit. We were still a few miles away. To give you a clear picture, there were only 10 of us. Maria, her mother, her father, her young brother, their neighbors, and me. It was clear in the sky, full moon, no clouds. Me and Maria were walking at the back. Maria stopped to tie her shoelaces, and I took the opportunity to go into the little bushes at the side of the road to pee. It was only for a few minutes. As soon as we continued on our journey, the road was no longer empty. There were hundreds of people, it seemed, some adorned in church attire, some in casual clothes, and they were going the same direction as us. Nothing seemed odd to us teenagers, though, but the most distinct part of that moment was the sheer quietness. I mean, it was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. Maria and I rushed to her family. The moment we reached them, Maria's mom and dad and their male neighbor were praying. After they were done with the prayer, Maria asked her dad what was going on. Her dad didn't hide anything, he just said, but not out loud, "Maria, you see all the people around us? We were joined by 5 more people. The rest of the people you see are not alive. They are spirits." We were so scared that we kept quiet until we reached our destination. After this encounter, I never ran from home again. Maria herself never wants to talk about that night. Miss Pennyjoy, from April B. I graduated high school in the late 90s with a high GPA, a great scholarship to a good college, and complete academic burnout from my senior year. After a lot of discussion, my parents and the college agreed to let me take a year off and defer my scholarship. In the UK, they call this a gap year. Instead of using it to travel or volunteer, however, I wanted to use it to sleep, hang out, and experience life as a teenager without the worry of tests, deadlines, and essays looming over me. I got a job at a video store. I had a lot of movies to catch up on too, and I took on some babysitting jobs on the rare weekends I had off. While there were a few creepy stories from that job, this story centers on one of my babysitting gigs. Not long into that first summer, my mom told me that one of her colleagues at the hospital was being moved to second shift and needed someone to pick her daughter up from her day camps and watch her until she got home around midnight a few nights a week. She was willing to pay a staggering $5 an hour, unheard of money for a babysitter in those times. I jumped at the opportunity, and we set up a trial run the next week. The girl, we'll call her Lily, was a good-natured 11-year-old, having just entered her awkward phase, but not at the point where she had noticed yet. I picked her up from art camp with her mom and headed to the heart of town. They didn't live too far from us, though they lived in one of the large 19th century homes close to downtown that the town elites rather hopefully called the Garden District, in some attempt to give it an air of distinction. The homes in general were stately and beautifully kept, but the truth is, there were so few of them due to a tornado that passed through our town in the 1920s. Hardly any of them stood 3 in a row anymore. Lily's house was an exception, standing in a row of 5 antique houses, and was actually one of the oldest in town. Not a frilly Queen Anne or a stately columned Greek revival. It was a simple white 1850s farmhouse, rectangular, with a modest front porch and a large sleeping porch on the side. Downstairs, a great room, parlor, now the master bedroom, dining room, bathroom, and tiny kitchen. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, which were Lily's domain as a lucky only child. I had passed by it many times while walking to the library, but had not given it much notice because of its more interesting neighbors. I'd like to say that when I stepped onto the front lawn, I felt some kind of chill in the air or some sort of heavy feeling, but in fact, everything was perfectly normal. I got a tour, and her mom said she would go out to run errands and be back in a few hours. That afternoon flew by. I aced the interview, pocketed my $20, and went home, excited to start the next week. As the summer wore on, Lily and I got to know each other well and settled into a routine. I often brought movies for us to watch together as a treat for her finishing her chores. I loved showing her some favorites from my childhood, like Goonies and Flight of the Navigator. It wasn't until the 4th of July that our routine was interrupted. I had just gotten back from my shift at the video store, a slow night, when Lily's mom called to tell me that she was going to have to go in on her day off. The ER was more packed than usual. Lily's father was supposed to have her, but had switched weekends to go on a fishing trip. She asked me if I could watch her overnight for double pay and popcorn and pizza. She didn't have to ask me twice. Popcorn and pizza and double pay when I'd mostly be sleeping? Sounded like a great deal. I hadn't made any plans for the night since my shift ended after all the fireworks anyway, and I hate getting to parties after everyone's been drinking for a while. I got to Lily's at the same time as the pizza and saw her mom off. As I mentioned before, Lily had the entire upstairs to herself. One of the rooms was her bedroom, and across the landing there was the bathroom and another bedroom, which had a sofa, television, some beanbag chairs, and Lily's desk. A swanky setup for an 11-year-old, right? After we watched Casper for the 10th time, Lily swooning over Devon Sawa the entire time, she went to sleep in her room, and I settled down on the sofa with American Beauty and drifted off. As I said before, even though the house was old and plain, it never spooked me out, even at night. It was creaky as all old houses are, especially creaky to be honest, as it had a marked tilt to the south from settling into the earth. One game Lily and I played was racing marbles and bouncy balls from one end of the room to the other in her lounge. Even so, creaky as the house was, I slept like a log through all the house's moaning and groaning, and even the errant firework. But after the sun rose, I could tell from the light creeping through my closed eyelids. The floorboards in the room started creaking like someone was pacing up and down along them. I thought it might be Lily looking for something, so I just kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep, so she wouldn't ask me to help her. I wasn't ready to wake up yet, but the sound kept on for so long, and it seemed like the person wasn't actually moving around the room, but pacing right in front of the sofa. I was facing the back of the sofa, so I couldn't see any shadows, but I could feel their closeness. "Lily," I said, "are you okay, hun?" The pacing suddenly stopped, and in that moment I opened my eyes, looking at the plaid tweed of that old sofa, the hair standing up all over my body, just like the fibers of its worn surface. Whoever or whatever that was, it didn't feel like Lily. I swallowed, sat up, and turned around. Nothing, and the presence was gone. The room felt as empty as it looked. I quickly got dressed and went into Lily's room. Her bed was made. I went downstairs to see if she was eating breakfast, realizing I had no idea what her morning routine was. On the table was a note from Lily, saying she had gone to spend the morning with a friend. They'd left over an hour ago. The house felt very still, very quiet, but again, not at all heavy or wrong. I called her mom to confirm the playdate, locked up, and left, making a note to ask some questions the next time I came over. The next time I babysat, I asked as casually as possible if the house had any weird history. Lily squinted at me, then nodded sagely. "You saw her then?" "Saw her?" "The lady." "Well, I didn't see anyone," I said, "but it did seem like there was someone in the room, someone watching me." "She was probably checking you out," Lily said. "She didn't do anything bad, did she?" "No, just woke me up, pacing." "Yeah, she does that. She's just worried. She looks out for me, surprised it took so long for you to see her, or hear her." "Why does she look out for you?" "Well, I always wondered too. So last year I went to the library and looked at the microfiche and stuff. Did you know there used to be nothing around the house when it was built? Crazy to think about. Anyway, there was a bunch of houses in 1928 when that big tornado hit. See that lot across the street? That whole block where there's just one house?" She pointed. "There used to be 4 houses there. The couple who lived here had kids who were over there playing when the storm hit and wiped out 3 of those houses. Almost everyone in them died, including the kids. She never got over it, and she died of a broken heart. So I think she stayed around to look after the children who lived here after. Do you know what her name was?" "Penelope Joy. Isn't that a pretty name? Penny Joy?" "Yeah, I think so. And you think she likes me?" "Yeah. And you know, I bet she was worried you'd be worried since I left without saying goodbye the other day." "Yeah, that was a little thoughtless of you." "I was trying to be thoughtful and not wake you up." "Well, kudos for trying." Lily's mom soon after went back to day shift when the school year started, so I only babysat Lily occasionally after that. But we kept in touch. When Lily was 14, her mother remarried, and they welcomed a new baby. Lily wasn't too happy about giving up her awesome living arrangements right as she went to high school. But when her mother offered to give her the enormous downstairs bedroom in exchange, she couldn't resist. I asked if Pennyjoy was looking after the baby now. She laughed at me and said, "Of course she is." Encounters, again on your favorite podcast apps. I've always liked those stories about I was the target. From Mads07. I hail from a well-known UK city known as Colchester. Yes, it has the same name as the infamous Colchester Underpass, where the Bunny Man supposedly stalks. Unfortunately, we don't have any urban legends as renowned as that, unless you count the claims of people seeing spectral figures around old Roman settlements. But my story is different than that. For privacy reasons, I'll be changing the names of any places and people involved that I might mention. For some background information, I was a full-time college student, so I took up a part-time job at a local pub to learn some bartending skills to help me at university. The pub I worked at was small, very secluded, and old, dating back to the early 16th century, and still holds up to this day. Most customers you get are the ones that are local to the area. Any others are a bonus. I tended to work the day shifts. They're quiet, which is what I prefer, as I can get most chores done, plus the hours are more set. I didn't like the night shifts mainly because they were rowdier, and you weren't sure whether you would get off at 8 p.m. or at midnight. Now, to get to the part you're all interested in. I was not supposed to work the night shift that night. I was called up last minute, as the person who was supposed to be there called in sick. As much as I didn't want to do it, I knew I couldn't say no. Plus, think of the money, as my mom would always say. My shift started at 6. Mom dropped me off and said Dad would pick me up when I was ready. The shift went, unfortunately, as expected. Not only were most of the locals there, but also the Irish farm workers, who were infamous for drinking their weight in Jamesons and Guinness, and would often not leave until the absolute last second before closing. My boss was out for the night, so I was on my own. Less to say, I wasn't the happiest of workers, mainly polishing cutlery unless someone asked for a drink, trying to drown out most of the boisterous yells coming from the pool table behind me. It was like that for most of the night. It wasn't until going on 11 o'clock that I was able to persuade everyone out the door, so I could start the lockup jobs. The pub was left in a deafening silence once the final customer left, something I was always uncomfortable with. To distract myself, I turned my attention to the standard jobs you would do when locking up a restaurant: sweeping the floors, cleaning the glasses, emptying the ashtrays, etc. It wasn't until I went to check the bathrooms that the first incident happened. I was cleaning the mirrors hung over the sink when an explosive sound rang out from the bar area. The sort of sound that echoes and forces you to clutch your ears in pain. I was terrified. Like most people, my fight-or-flight response kicked in. I began imagining the worst scenarios possible, such as the possibility that a whole shelf of drinking glasses fell, or a more sinister act caused by an intruder. This sound did not cease, but instead grew progressively louder. Despite the pain in my ears, I had to stop whatever was causing the sound before the whole village woke up. I sprinted to the bar, expecting to see shattered drinking glasses strewn across the floor. There was nothing. Now, you might think I would be relieved, but if anything, I was more terrified, because the sound was still going, and there was no obvious sign of where it was coming from. After frantically looking for any sign of disturbance, I found that it was coming from the speaker. I yanked the plug from the power socket and was left with immediate silence. Well, silence from an environmental perspective. I can still remember the palpitations of my heart ramming like a jackhammer against my ribcage, sending tremors throughout every nerve of my body. I hunched over the bar to give myself time to decompress, to come back to some kind of homeostasis. My brain was in a daze and could barely contemplate what had just happened. After taking in a few deep breaths, I began to calm down, and my thoughts became clearer. But I still had no logical answer to what had just occurred. In the end, I decided it was due to some technical issue that was beyond my understanding, and I went back to my duties. I decided to leave the bathrooms until last, focusing on sweeping in the bar and restaurant area. Personally, I don't mind sweeping. It helps me to think, allows my internal monologue to rant about any number of things. It wasn't long after I calmed down from the first incident that the second one occurred. Just to put it out there, I'm not one to completely believe in superstitions or the paranormal. However, I refuse to go near Ouija boards or dabble in conjuration. But it was this incident that made me believe otherwise. The deafening silence once again plagued my ears. The only comfort I received was the sound of bristles on hard floor and the scraping of dirt. But then my ears pricked up, the hairs on my body stood up, and my sweeping ceased. A third sound could be heard, but it was not coming from me. Slow creaks with deliberately timed pauses between each one could be heard on the floor above me. The sound of footsteps creaking slowly towards the upstairs staircase, which fed into the kitchen and eventually the restaurant where I currently stood. It was as if something was taunting me. Someone or something was purposefully trying to frighten me. It worked. My flight response took a hold of me, so I dropped the broom and ran out of the pub into the front patio. Sensing my movements, the slow, deliberate creaks above suddenly changed into a fast-paced sprint, which bellowed throughout the pub. I was being chased. Boom, 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 boom. The booming footsteps collided with concrete from the kitchen. But I was already out the door, running around the side of the pub into the back garden. The garden looked sinister, with the black silhouette of the trees and bushes contrasting against the pale moonlight. The spiny branches of the bushes welcomed me as I dove underneath the shrubbery and tumbled down into a trench, the thorns scraping the bare skin on my arms and ankles. Not long afterwards, I heard heavy footfalls contacting with dried leaves and other shrubbery, as it also must have made its way round the side of the pub and was now seeking me out. Sprawled out across the ground, face down, my chest and other body parts dug into the dead pieces of wood from fallen branches. I wanted to flatten myself down as much as possible. I dared to not risk a shadow in fear of that thing finding me. I felt like I was suffocating due to the pressure on my chest as well as the adrenaline. My lungs were not in sync with my heart rate, but I refused to let my rapid breathing give me away. I lay there, unmoving, forcing myself to hold my breath, only allowing a couple of short breaths to prevent me from passing out. The rustling of footsteps paced slowly and tauntingly around the perimeter of the garden, like how a predator circles its prey before the attack, a form of torture targeting the fight or flight response. It knows I'm here, I thought. I know it's here, but only one of us has the upper hand over the other. I wish I could truly convey the feeling of powerlessness I felt when faced with something that unfathomable, but that's only a feeling those who have experienced it can understand. The pacing continued, but a sudden stumble a couple meters from where I lay sent every muscle in my body into action mode. It was the sudden move someone does when they do a double take, like when they saw something. The footsteps quietened, as if it was trying to conceal itself, but instinct told me of the thing that I feared most, the whispers of footsteps growing closer. I heard heavy, raspy breathing. Terrified it was mine, I clasped my hand over my mouth and nose, but I quickly realized it was not coming from me, but from something right above me. The bush was now the only barrier between me and it, a faint shadow cast over the moonlight earth in front of me, the breathing, grating, and guttural announcing its presence. I engaged every muscle in my body, ready to make the run for my life. Rapid and savage rustling came from the bush, as if the leaves themselves started battling and tearing at each other. It was trying to get through. Whether what I did next was a good idea or not, I couldn't tell you. All logic and sense of reasoning left me, and I could only count on my primitive instincts to get me away, anywhere away from this thing. I sprinted from the trench, exiting through a gap, and headed towards the road. The sound of running quickly followed me, as I expected it would do. I was still being chased. Retracing my steps, past the side of the pub, I let my legs take me anywhere, just anywhere. The sprinting behind me did not falter. It was determined. I could hear the paces catching up to me with every stride, with every rasp of breath that echoed throughout my ears. As one last-ditch effort, I forced my lungs to fill with air, ready to scream. But at the 11th hour, by the skin of my teeth, at the last gasp, I heard a car revving down the country road. The full beam of light came into complete view as it blinded and halted me to a complete stop. The sprinting behind me had also stopped, and a rapid rustle to the side of me was heard. Standing on the edge of the road I was about to run on, I saw the recognizable beige paint job of an old Maverick. My dad's car! The feeling of relief and gratitude I felt was beyond anything I've ever known. Dad pulled up beside me, and I immediately raced to the front seat door on the other side and got in, locking the door as I did so. Panting, I clipped my seatbelt on and waited for my dad to drive away. The car didn't move. I turned to him shaking and out of breath. "Aren't you going to drive?" I said, with too much scold. But he only looked at me unblinkingly, a look of disapproval and concern on his face. "What happened to your arms?" He scolded back at me. I remember sitting there still trying to catch my breath, and I looked at my arms. The cuts from the thorns were much deeper than I thought. But more importantly, I had to check if that thing was still there. I bent forwards, looking out my dad's side window. Nothing. gone like a wisp of smoke, like it was never there in the first place. Dad followed my gaze, confusion added to his already darkened face. "What are you looking at?" I snapped out of my trance and pointed outside as a form of gesture. I tripped and fell behind the bushes. There was a trench there and I struggled to get out, and that's what happened. I'm okay though, just a little shaken up, since it was dark and everything. The look on my dad's brow slacked a little, but not completely. He rolled his eyes and put the car in gear, and we drove off. Once we were a couple 100 meters away, I looked out the back window, and I could have sworn I saw a looming dark figure watching us as we drove away. Why didn't you tell your dad the truth? You're probably all thinking. The short answer, my dad is very much a skeptic. He believes in nothing supernatural. Even if I did tell him what happened, he would not have believed me, and would instead think I was chased by some deranged man and would try to get the police involved. I did consider it. Talking to the police, I mean. But something in my instincts told me that what I experienced was not human, so the police would not have been able to do anything. Once home, I immediately went upstairs to my room. After checking that the windows were locked, I collapsed onto my bed. I didn't bother changing into my pajamas. Despite feeling heavier than a sack of lead, it was a long time before I could fall asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the echoing of a guttural breathing and fast-paced footsteps plagued my ears, forcing my brain to imagine it repeatedly. Like a cyclical loop, it was a never-ending narrative, but nature eventually took its course. My tiredness and exhaustion must have taken over me as my mind went blank. The next morning, I woke up to an angry message from my boss, who was reprimanding me for not locking up the building before leaving. Before you judge him, you need to see it from his perspective. I was negligent. It's not like he saw the events that went down. If I did tell him, he would assume that I was making up an excuse, trying to take him for a fool. Or he might think it to be a human and try to call the police as well. Both were outcomes I didn't want to face. But luckily, he's a reasonable guy. Once I sent an apology and promised him that it was an accident and that it would not happen again, he forgave and forgot quickly. But it was a while before I went back to the pub, and that was only because my mom wanted to visit. It was light and full of people, so I didn't feel as terrified to walk in. But the hairs on my body still stood up, like there was some kind of presence. We were there for a couple of hours, my mom doing most of the talking as she's more familiar with the locals. But I did get into a conversation with a regular called Jamie. It was mostly small talk, mainly me discussing what university I was going to and what I planned to do when I got there. It was like that for a while, until the conversation took a turn that I did not expect and never would have. For some quick background information, Jamie is an old soul who has lived in the village for many decades. He knows the ins and outs of its history, even the far-fetched stories passed down from past residents. "I heard you forgot to lock up the pub before you left," Jamie chuckled. "News spreads quick when you work at a pub." "Yeah," I replied with a forced smile. "Not the best way to end your last shift, is it, girl? Oh well, guess your tiredness got the better of you. Or maybe that ghost was winding you up." I felt my body freeze, and I stared at him blankly. Tiny words eventually escaped my lips. "Ghost? What ghost?" "Have you never heard? This pub is supposedly haunted. Quite a few people have experienced strange events happening in here. Late at night, usually." I sat up taller. "What events? Like physically seeing a figure?" "Nah, nothing like that. Little things like creaking floorboards or flickering lights. Even the radio has turned itself on a couple of times, but nothing serious." Jamie chuckled as he said this, but I didn't. If anything, it made me feel worse. Feel vulnerable, as for some reason I was the one that was targeted. "It's probably just a bunch of stories," Jamie spoke. "But hey, if you want to see some kind of figure, walk out to the restaurant area and look at the pub family photo on the wall. Furthest window to the right." I quickly rose from my seat and walked to where he described. I squinted at the photograph, which was in black and white, despite it only being from 2010. "I can't see anything," I called back. "Use the light on your phone," Jamie answered. Turning on the torchlight on my phone, I hovered it over the far right window within the picture. And that's when I saw it. Very faintly, the shadow of a contorted face within darkness that replicated a menacing glare, staring right back at me. Ironic, isn't it? No matter how many horror movies we watch, no matter how many times we shout at the characters on the screen to run away, we allow the dramatic irony to get the better of us. Yet we cease to follow our own advice when dealing with the paranormal, and try to decipher everything with logic instead of just trusting our instincts. From my time at university thus far, one thing a professor taught me is that not everything can be proven, and not every hypothesis will have a logical conclusion at the end of it. You can either accept the outcome and move on, or try a different method to yield different results. My point being, maybe some things are meant to stay mysteries. Some things are better kept uninvestigated for our own safety, unless you want to attract unwanted attention from a force far superior to us. Well, that's about the end of my anecdote. Whether you believe it or consider it as another counterfeit ghost story, that's up to you. I'm still not entirely sure what happened to me that night. Maybe there is a logical, scientific explanation to what happened. But regardless, the paranormal is not something to mess with, despite what you choose to believe in. I'm about to head into my second semester of my first year at university. That means exams. Hopefully, I'll have a better experience than what I had at the pub. Good luck to all those part-timers out there. A word of advice, always follow your instincts. The sound in the walls of a hotel. From Rosie. My boyfriend Pete and I work together. Our work requires us to travel sometimes. We go together whenever our schedules align. Pete was sent to go to a smaller town a couple of hours away from where we live. It's really popular for its cottage life and resort. It's very pretty. I've only heard of how posh and pretty it was, but never had the opportunity to go myself. But he said he had to go for an overnight, and asked if I wanted to join. Well, of course I did. Everything ran smoothly throughout the day, until we started to settle into our hotel. We had a suite, so it came with a kitchenette. The hotel was quiet when we checked in, as if we were the only ones in it. Which I guess isn't too strange during off-season in cottage country or a town. When we were checking in, Pete was in and out of meetings virtually, so I had to end up doing a lot of the unpacking. I had to make a couple of trips, so I'd been in the only 2 elevators in the building a few times already. On the last ride to get to my floor, I ran into an older lady who was getting on the elevator. She said to me, "I guess we aren't the only ones on the floor." She laughed as I got off. I simply replied, "I guess we'll see you around." Later that evening, I needed something from the car. When the elevator came, it was one I knew I'd taken before, but I noticed now that there was a rear door to it. I thought it was strange. I was sure that door wasn't there before. When I got out to my car, the mood was eerie. I'm sure the cloudy skies and the tiredness and hunger weren't helping much. When I got closer to my car, I saw the groundskeeper sweeping up garbage. I smiled and said hello, which he ignored, not even flinching as I got closer. I checked it off as strange, but went on. After grabbing everything I needed, I locked my car when I noticed another groundskeeper walking 2 dogs. I said hi again with a smile. He also ignored me, but one of his dogs looked at me. There was no excitement in that look, just curiosity, like I was another pole on the street. I headed back in, and when I did, another guest was walking their dog. He didn't seem to notice me when I looked at him in an empty parking lot. It was starting to feel unsettling with all of these strange one-off encounters. When I got back to the room in a no rear door elevator, I started to make dinner. Pete was still working at the time. I told him that I'd discovered we had older neighbors, so we should be mindful of our noise. He said he heard them moving around earlier. Maybe 3 minutes later, we heard knocking on the wall we shared. It sounded like something we definitely should be minding our business about. Pete and I looked at each other and laughed. A few minutes later, we heard it again and laughed once more, talking about how thin the walls were here. Except this time, we heard tapping towards the ceiling. We were on the top floor. There was no one above us. Pete came up with some excuse like hotel settling, but we both didn't fully buy that. I took a shower while Pete cleaned up. I made sure to close the door so I wouldn't feel a draft after the shower. When I finished up, I tried to open the door, of course, but it felt like it was locked. I was sure I had not locked it. Why would I? I called out to Pete to help me open it. Luckily, he easily opened it up. He asked me if I was okay, figuring that the door must be set weird. I mentioned to him that I wasn't comfortable with this hotel. We both agreed to leave this hotel first thing in the morning. Now, I was really craving some chocolate, so Pete and I went to the hotel shop. The front desk lady did not make eye contact even when we approached the desk. She looked up as soon as Pete started talking. She looked really robotic and shifty. This wasn't work exhaustion. It was more like she had switched into someone else. Now, something about Pete is that he is very much a people person. He can make friends anywhere, anyhow. It's not uncommon for some young ladies to assume he's flirting, but the way she reacted and talked, she was so lifeless. It was strange for both of us. And no, I'm okay with other girls who try to flirt. Pete is good at setting up boundaries. Sometimes it works out better for us when he gets us better deals. Anyway, we both thought this was weird and walked away from the desk, sort of creeped out. Around 4 a.m., I woke up and had a hard time falling back asleep. I decided to go to the couch to do some reading. Before I sat down, I got a glass of water and looked outside the balcony. There was a small boathouse-like building, well kept, that was probably a small hangout spot for guests. It wasn't strange for buildings like this to have the lamps or lights on, and the lights were on, I noticed, with the wide curtains drawn. Suddenly, the shadow of a human figure appeared at the window. It was like looking at a drawing, though. It didn't look like a normal human-shaped shadow. It stood at the windows, but then walked away. I was really creeped out by this. I quickly went back to bed, accidentally waking Pete up for a second, but he went back to sleep after. But not before I buried my face into Pete. No matter how hard I tried that night, all the little noises kept me up until it was time to go. Needless to say, I was packed and ready to go before Pete said good morning. He joked about how this was the first time I'd gotten ready before him. I don't know if I'm comfortable with him going alone on these trips anymore. At the same time, I don't know if I want to do these trips with him anymore. I sure won't be coming back here. Black magic is very real. From Blessed Blister. I'm a 23-year-old woman from India. When I was around 20, I left my hometown to go study in a quaint suburban coastal town, which I came to love quite quickly. I soon found a hostel close to my university and rented out a room for myself. This was a room for 2 people, but I wasn't too keen on having a roommate, so I decided to pay extra and keep the room all to myself, something I would soon come to regret. When I moved in, I found a tiny doll made with cotton. It had been left behind in the cupboard by the previous tenant. I thought it was cute, and I didn't want to throw it out, so I just let it be. Pretty soon I settled in, though the first couple of days I found it difficult to fall asleep. But the sheer amount of work at the university soon after would leave me so exhausted that I would just come back and crash. This one time, though, there was some kind of protest happening in the town, so we were given about 2 weeks off. During this time, I lazed around, catching up on TV series and movies, barely leaving my room except at mealtimes. My days would just go by in a blur, but when night fell, that's when things started to happen. I hadn't noticed before, but as I lie awake in bed one night, sluggish but not sleepy, I saw a shadow bounce around on the wall. When I say shadow, I mean, it was more of a dark shape with no features, moving around quickly from one corner of the room to the other. The window in my room was right at the foot of my bed, and it overlooked the street. So my first thought was that it was probably the shadow of a car or some other vehicle passing by, even though I hadn't heard the sound of a vehicle pass. But when your mind wants to rationalize things, it has a way of sticking to it and dismissing something unreasonable. So that's what I thought, and I shrugged it off. Every single night, this shadow showed up. Sometimes it would hover near the window for a while, then move to and fro between the walls. It got so frequent that I got absolutely used to it. I didn't get a negative vibe or anything from it, and at one point it was even quite peaceful to look at while dozing off. One night, however, something changed. It was like a switch was flipped, and the atmosphere in the room just became very, very dark. I was so used to being in my room now that I was very comfortable. But that night, as I turned the lights off, there was a sense of inescapable dread that I'd never felt in there before. I couldn't quite place why I was feeling that way, and no matter how hard I tried to relax, I found it difficult to breathe, like I was on edge and something terrible was going to happen. Then came the shadow, doing what it did as usual, but this time, it came closer. It wasn't near the window anymore. It hovered right over my bed, frantically moving all over the walls around me. This was unnerving because it felt malicious, like the shapeless shadow thing wanted to attack me. I shut my eyes for a minute, hoping it would go away, and when I opened them, the shadow wasn't hovering anymore. Instead, it was now stagnant, standing tall as a dark mass right in front of my window. The light from the window stood out around it, illuminating it. I was absolutely frozen in terror. Some part of me wanted to scream, but I couldn't even function. This black silhouette with no discernible features just seemed to pulsate. It came closer and went back as if trying to break some kind of invisible barrier between me and it. For some reason, it could not get close to me, and in that moment, that meant everything. I quickly sat up in bed, panicking and hyperventilating. It was still there, now moving frantically around my bed, trying to edge its way into me by all means. I keep idols of the Lord Shiva and the goddess Kali. They're on my bedstand, and the only thing I could think to do at the time was to clutch those idols close to me. As I did that, the shadow figure seemed to pause for a minute, but it resumed its grotesque shadowy dance, more fiercely now, leaving me a terrified mess huddled in my own bed, crying my eyes out. At some point, I think the sheer exhaustion from the stress took over, and I finally nodded off, still holding onto those idols, keeping them close to my chest. As soon as the sun came up, I was jolted awake. I ran downstairs to find the warden, not caring that it was still early in the morning. In between sobs, I managed to tell her what happened as coherently as I could. Thankfully, she did not dismiss my story. She immediately called in a priest to come check out the room. When the priest came by, he sat in the room going into some kind of meditative trance for a while. When he opened his eyes, he looked at me, asking me if there was anything in the room that did not belong to me. It didn't come to me right away, but then I thought about that doll, the one I'd found in the cupboard when I'd moved in. I told him that, and I went and found it to show it to him. He took a deep breath and said a few shlokas, or incantations, while pulling out spools of sacred thread smeared in turmeric. He wrapped the doll in the thread completely and slowly took it out, placing it in his bag. He told me and the warden how this doll was a medium of black magic, one that had summoned a Chudale or a witch. According to legend, the Chudale is a vengeful spirit of a woman who has died an unnatural death. The priest said that whoever had made and left this doll had dipped it in the blood of some poor woman who had passed recently. This had invoked the Trudale to wake up and inhabit the doll. The only reason it could not attack me was perhaps because of the idols I had next to my bed, and the more I held on to them, the Trudale could not come near me. The priest said he would go burn the doll in a holy fire altar. He gave me a talisman to wear all the time. I shifted to another room while the warden did a puja, or ritual, in this one, to cleanse it of any negative energy. Till this day, that has been the scariest, most terrifying experience in my life. And no matter where I go, even to this day, I make sure to carry my idols with me. Angel or Demon, from Thick McChick. This was my second nursing job, and was considerably different than the first, which was a rehabilitation and mental health care facility. This was a juvenile detention facility. Yep, a kids' jail. Now, I was not nearly as intimidated by this as I admittedly should have been. I figured my position was in the wellness department, and that containing combative children would be the support staff's responsibility, since they were specifically trained for this. I just needed to attend to the children's health concerns, and do the medication passes, and basically tend to my own affairs and business. With that in mind, I began my job as a nurse in a juvenile detention facility. Children acting absolutely buck wild was nothing new to me. My very first day, a teen boy from the offender cottage, if you catch my drift, was brought to an intake cell through the Sally port and held there in one of the cells until the nursing staff could assess him. When myself and the nurse who had been training me got there, we had to do an evaluation on him to see the level of severity of his injuries. That way we could treat and document them. This lad had repeatedly slammed his forehead against the inside of his intake cell and had managed to get about a quarter-sized goose egg on his forehead. It wasn't very pretty, but I would find things like this, although certainly not common, but they weren't rare either. I kinda had a baptism by fire first shift. Welcome to the jungle. I was the evening shift nurse when she came through intake that night. A chubby little cherubic 8-year-old girl, shuffling over and sitting down in one of our chairs, looking scared and forlorn. Her messy, loose, dark brown curls hung midway over her chestnut brown eyes. For this story, I'll call her Angel. The facility services manager asked if she could stay with me for a while, since the kids had decided that Saturday evening was a perfect time to riot. He and the support staff had their hands more than full. Of course, she could sit over by my nurse's station, and I'd keep a watchful eye on her. My evening med pass was done, so it wasn't really a problem. She was a literal babe in the woods. She was apprehensive and appeared to be somewhat overwhelmed. I couldn't imagine being in holding as an adult, let alone an 8-year-old little girl. She had to be terrified. To her credit, she never cried, never whined. Honestly, she impressed me with her level of maturity and awareness. Maybe since hindsight is 20/20, I miscalculated her maturity and awareness for what it actually was: disconnect and apathy. I clocked out at 10 p.m., and it was approaching that time. The kids did not stop rioting just because I was going home soon, so the manager and support staff were still swamped. Angel was quietly sitting in her chair, continuing to nod off with her little brown bouncy curls, framing her round, sweet, pretty little face with pinkish red cheeks and big doe eyes. I decided, since I was leaving soon, to lay her down in a cot in the infirmary and just let her sleep. It was almost 10, and she's 8 years old. She'd had a very emotional day. She had to be exhausted, I thought. I lay her down in the cot after I fluffed up her pillow, and I grabbed her a couple of blankets out of the warmer to tuck her in. She practically fell asleep as I explained to her that the intake staff were just a few feet away, and if she needed anything, just go to them. That was my introduction to Angel's heavenly side. I don't remember how long it took for me to see Angel's demonic side, but I do know that it didn't take very long. To be on a med pass and see her in the throes of an all-out nuclear-level meltdown was really a shock to the system. The support staff had several men who were between 6 and 6.5 feet and between 250 to 300 pounds. The first time I saw Angel kicking, screaming, biting, and hitting while 4 men of this size and 2 women of a much smaller stature tried to restrain her, I was in a complete state of shock. Keep in mind I had worked as a surgery tech for 10 years in labor and delivery before I went back to nursing school. So I like to believe that I've seen my fair share of kicking, bucking, and fighting. In all honesty, very little shocked me at this point. What did shock me, though, the quickness in which Angel morphed into a kicking, screaming, biting, unholy terror when she felt slighted in any way, or heard the word no when she demanded something, because she rarely requested anything. So I was on my evening med pass to the inside cottages. To give you a clearer visual, we had cottages inside the fenced-in area of the facility, and a cottage outside of the fenced-in area. The cottage where Angel was housed was one of the inside cottages. The cottage had all of the kids in their rooms in a lockdown state due to Angel having a full-on meltdown, and the support staff were trying to get her under control. I decided to come back to that cottage once things had calmed down, and the kids weren't confined to their rooms. As I was exiting the cottage, Angel was being restrained right by the door that I needed to exit. 6 full-grown adults were trying to restrain this 8-year-old little girl so she wouldn't be a harm nor hazard to herself and others. She was bucking like a bronco, screaming, thrashing around, using foul language that I didn't even know when I was her age. She was threatening staff, too. I looked at her face and into her eyes as I was leaving. It stopped me dead in my tracks. This child looked completely different than the chubby, cherubic little girl that I tucked in on her intake evening. Her pupils were so dilated that the chestnut brown iris of her eyes was now jet black. She had very little white sclera showing at all. This wasn't just low-light pupil dilation either. The black dang near took over the entire eye. Her voice unnerved me the most. It was guttural and deep, like a man's voice. She no longer sounded like a girl or a little girl. And the hatred, that hatred that accompanied that glare, was beyond disturbing. It was downright scary, and I do not shake easily. My gut instinct was just to get away and to do so quickly, and that is precisely what I did. I finished up my med pass to the other cottages and came back to Angel's cottage. Upon my return, I learned they took her to intake, where she was placed in a cell. She hurt herself during her outburst, and that's putting it very lightly, and I would need to do a physical assessment and report on her injuries when I got back to the wellness department. So with apprehension, I headed to wellness to drop off my med bag and head to the intake department, which was right next to wellness. I get there, and I'm told Angel really flipped out when she was placed in her cell. She, like the boy on my first day, also banged her head repeatedly against the cell walls and got a goose egg on her forehead. This was a common occurrence for any of the youths that were placed in a cell as a form of revolting against being put there, but at least there they couldn't harm the staff and other inmates. I entered her cell with apprehension as she sat with slumped shoulders on the concrete bench in a straitjacket. Gone was the hellacious demon that was kicking, hitting, biting, and bucking the support staff with obsidian eyes and a voice full of manly bass. Before me sat a broken and bewildered little girl, just like the cherubic child I saw on her first night here, looking up at me with pain and sorrow, regret, and a huge red and pink knot smack dab in the middle of her head. Granted, you'd be correct in thinking the little girl's confused look was from her conking her head. That was a tiny part of it, though. This child looked like she was lost and didn't know what was going on. I asked her the typical questions of what hurt and where, so I could properly document and treat her injuries. She answered sheepishly, and you could tell she was just completely spent. I queried about the incident in the cottage, and she was literally at a loss. She remembered nothing. Yes, people can get blackout angry, but here's the thing. This child would go from 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye. There was no boiling point for Angel. Things were fine until they weren't. And unfortunately for us, we never knew when the volcano would erupt. I honestly didn't think Angel knew herself. I just know I personally witnessed a child that was normally very sweet absolutely explode out of nowhere for absolutely no reason at all. Then she'd immediately calm down and could not recall what happened or why it happened. She would be just as confused as the rest of us, and very apologetic. To quote Red from the Shawshank Redemption, "I do believe those first 2 years were the worst for him, and I also believe if things had gone that way, this place would have got the best of him." Except, in Angel's case, it was 2 months and he was a she. I personally tried a few different solutions to keep Angel calm. What ended up working out for the best at the time, I had a Papillon who loved to sing with me and it made for a really cute video. Angel really liked my pup, and I made her a promise. For every day she could go the entire day without acting out and getting a write-up, she'd get a brand new video made just for her of my pup and I singing. It was more my pup singing than me, and I'm sure she was grateful for that. Now, all of this prefaces the point I'm about to make. This girl adored my pupper. She loved the videos and they were always the highlight of her day. She'd have done anything to get to watch him, including not flipping out on staff and causing an incident, because we had a deal and she was aware of that. She acts out, no video for Angel that day. So she'd come over to the wellness department and I'd ask her if she'd been good that day. Kids being kids, they tend to lie to cover bad behavior. So I told her I'd be checking with the youth development supervisor, or YDS for the rest of this story, at her cottage to make sure she was honest with me. She always was truthful, probably because she knew I would check. Mostly she did really well. There were days when I'd ask if she'd been good, and she'd look at the floor and shake her head no. Her bottom lip would quiver and tears would well up in her eyes. She'd explain that she didn't know what happened and couldn't even remember what it was that she'd done wrong. I'd darn near cave in and show her the video anyway, but I simply couldn't do it. If I did, she could act with reckless abandon knowing she could see videos anytime she wanted to and didn't have to worry about her outbursts. Nope, that was not our deal. All this to say, I knew that child. This was a child that would have kept her behavior in check if it meant watching my pupper look at the ceiling and howl and sing with his little Papillon self. Now, those amongst you may say this was a child simply acting out, or a child with a mental illness, or both. Although I do feel both played a part in Angel's behavior, I know deep into my soul that there was something more than that. The inhuman strength, the Stygian eyes, the deep voice of a man who smokes 2 packs a day, the memory loss and that lack of recall, the minimal or non-existent triggers before a full-on raging, maniacal fit. If there were ever a case of demonic possession that I've witnessed with my own 2 eyes, Angel would be it. She literally ticks all the boxes off on the checklist. If you find this ending anticlimactic, dear reader or listener, let me add one last detail that I never mentioned when introducing you to Angel. The reason she came to our facility to begin with. Angel was placed into our care at 8 years of age for attempted murder. You see, she had stabbed her grandmother in the stomach over and over. An 8-year-old little girl. Still think demonic possession isn't possible in today's world? My time working for an environmental cleanup crew. From Billy Towers. Let me start by saying that if you are squeamish, you should stop listening or reading now, because the story I'm going to tell you gets weirder and more vile by the minute. There, that was your warning. I had taken a job as an environmental cleanup crew member in the summer. My main tasks were cleaning up parks and the sides of highways for any trash that people felt they could leave anywhere. This did not pay well, but the important part was the volunteer hours for my college scholarship, and being part of a green group looks really good on a resume. Not to mention my major was in biology, so it made sense to get some practical experience. The first few weeks were kind of boring. We were cleaning up parks and abandoned buildings, and everywhere else people felt they could leave their trash. The most exciting things I'd find during a shift were maybe a used condom or some leftover drug paraphernalia. Nothing worth writing home about. There were some entertaining tales for the group chat, but that was it. Everything was going as well as it could until about my 5th week of work. I had arrived at work and waited for the vans that drive the crew members out to different locations, as usual. As expected, people began to come in, and the team leader stood in front of the group, ready to give out assignments. Only something was different. There was only one assignment. One of the leaders, a tall white man named Todd, explained that there was a small marsh that was so polluted with trash and refuse that even though it was isolated from major water sources, it still posed a major threat to nearby ecosystems and even to people. Todd went on to explain that while more official organizations had done a majority of the cleaning, they still needed help from locals willing to step up and clear out what was left. I guess that was us. Now, normally, we were given some plastic gloves and a trash-grabbing claw. Not this time. This time, we were told to put on heavy overalls made out of some kind of thick rubber, galoshes that went almost to our knees, and thick rubber gloves that didn't breathe. Even though we were in an air-conditioned building, I was sweating bullets. Then we had to get in the vans. The ride to the marsh felt like a sauna. I think I'd polished off 3 water bottles by the time we got there. And when I saw where we were going to be working, I almost threw all of that water up. In front of us was a wetland that stunk to high heaven. It was a mix of rotten meat and raw sewage that had been sitting in the sun since the sun came out. We all had to be given special respirator masks that we were told to keep on at all times. This made me wish I'd read my contract more carefully, because something here had to be illegal. Still, I put the mask on and took a deep breath of filtered air. After the masks, we were each handed a trash bag and a grabbing claw before Todd stood in front of the crew again and explained that we would be working in teams of 3 to be as safe as possible. Each team would be given an air horn, so if they did have any trouble, they could sound an alarm and get help as soon as possible. After a long lecture about being safe and not being a hero, we were given our teams, then sent into the muck. I was teamed up with a brown-skinned, stout man named Raul and a blonde, thin girl named Crystal. We didn't know each other very well, but we all gave each other a sort of trust glance before walking in. The water went a little above our knees, but it was so dirty we couldn't see our legs beneath it. And the mud, or what I hoped was just mud, it was so thick, it felt like I sank a good 6 inches every time I put my foot down. The first hour or so went by uneventfully. It was really hard to talk over the masks on our faces, so any attempt at small talk simply came out as grunts, chuckles, or sighs. So we decided to have some fun with what we found in the marsh. I'd grabbed something soft and squishy with my trash claw and pulled it up to reveal a cute but absolutely filthy pink teddy bear. Crystal gave a sad sigh as I put the poor toy into the trash bag. As we continued through the quagmire, we heard our first air horn. Raul, Crystal, and I turned around quickly to see a woman blasting the air horn and a man struggling to pull something out of the water. We rushed over to the other team as quickly as our mud-sunk boots would let us, and we went over to the man. Raul went to one side of the man, and I went to the other, before reaching under the water. When I put my hands under, I felt what I immediately recognized as an arm. I pulled upward with all my strength. We slipped and slid in the sludge before finally pulling up a person with long hair from the sludge. With whatever strength we had left, the 3 of us hauled the person to shore and called for help. 2 hours later, paramedics showed up, and the person was brought to the hospital in an ambulance. I asked the other 2 team members what happened, and the woman simply said that sometimes, because of the silt, sinkholes form and can swallow people who aren't careful up in an instant. Todd told us that our first day at this marsh was over and that there would be new safety protocols in place. Against my better judgment, I did come back the next week. Something about this particular project had caught my attention, and I wanted to know exactly why. We were all given our gear and safety speech with one more caveat. We were given poles to poke for sinkholes. I was on a team with Raul and Crystal again, We gave each other fist bumps before walking into the muck again. Raoul walked ahead of us with his sinkhole rod as Crystal and I trotted behind, picking up chip bags, soda cans, and anything else we could fit in the bags. As I was walking, I felt something hard near my boot. I thought it was a rock, so I tried to push it aside with my boot. The rock, however, did not like that, and I felt something latch onto my boot with extreme pressure. I screamed as loud as I could in my mask before I heard an air horn behind me. I turned to see Crystal holding the air horn high in the air. I turned back to Raoul, who was rushing toward me. He reached into the water and grabbed something. He pointed a finger up to the sky, which I took as a sign to lift my leg, so I did. Raoul lifted something that looked like a long, strange tube in his hand, and as his hand left the water, it revealed what had latched on to my boot. A very angry and hissing snapping turtle. Another man had come up behind me, lifting me slightly from my shoulders. Then he and Raoul pulled me to shore. With the help of some of the other crew members and eventually animal control, we got the snapping turtle to release my boot, and it was sent somewhere much safer. Todd came up to me and asked if I wanted to go home. I took a look at the small puncture mark on my boot, then looked at him with a smile, asking if he had any duct tape. With a pair of new boots, I stepped back into the muck with my team, and we continued our shift. I took the lead this time, hoping that the next snapping turtle I run into bites the rod in front of me, and not my foot. We continued our shift until we heard the announcement that indicated the end of the day. Raoul and I turned around to see that Crystal was gone. There was no way she had walked all the way back to shore, so she had to be underwater. We searched the water, reaching in and feeling around for any sign of her. A few feet behind us, we heard something emerge from the water. We turned to the sound to see what had risen from the sludge. It wasn't Crystal, but a decomposing body facing us. The body began to approach, and I saw Raoul sign a cross on his chest before we heard a screech as the body dropped back into the water. Behind where the corpse had been standing was Crystal, who hurriedly wiped her hands before reaching to her side and blasting the air horn. A few hours later, the police arrived and pulled the body from the water. They asked us all several questions before telling us that this is now an active crime scene and we would not be allowed back here anytime soon. Given what I'd already seen these past 2 weeks, I didn't think I'd be coming back to that job either. She saved me. From Rice Krispie. For some background, I'm from New England, and my grandpa and I share a love of nature, hiking, and photography. Actually, I think I got that from him. We always went up to New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine in the fall for foliage photos and maple syrup. Once I was old enough, around 11 or 12, we started to do hikes. Shortly after that, in 2019, I moved away to Ohio, but I came back to visit during my winter and summer breaks. We took to hiking a new trail every time we visited, and the winter hikes were some of my favorite. Icicles make for some beautiful photos. Anyway, this story takes place during one of those winter hikes when I was around 12 or 13, somewhere in the White Mountains. I can't recall the trail name. My grandpa and I were on a moderate-level hiking trail, headed to a beautiful frozen waterfall in a ravine. The trail took us around a corner, and in front of us was the start of the ravine, as well as a group of hikers who were taking photos of the ravine, which was sparkling with snow and ice. We made small talk for a bit before they moved on, and we took their spot in front of the railing to take our own pictures. Something important to note about the railing was that it was the only thing separating the trail from the steep drop-off of at least 50 feet, but it had a gap of about 2 feet underneath it. Anyway, we were taking photos at this bend. I climbed onto a rock to get a better angle. As I was trying to slide carefully off this rock, with my hands behind me for stability and my legs out in front of me, both my hand and foot slipped on the ice. I started to slide like a greased bullet, and I was heading straight for the gap under the railing. There was a substantial and harrowing drop below. I did not have time to react, and neither did Grandpa, who was a few feet away taking pictures. Suddenly, with my feet hanging from the edge, an arm reached out and grabbed me around my waist. A woman in her late 20s, early 30s had caught me, had saved me. She helped me back onto my feet, and my grandpa thanked the woman profusely. She explained that she was with the group of hikers from before, who were now 5 minutes or so down the trail. We took a break so I could catch my breath, and she continued down the trail and out of sight. I didn't think about her explanation at the time. I was just grateful. But as I recalled this event a few years later, I realized there were some oddities. We never saw her with the group when they stopped to take pictures, and we never saw her after the event. I also hadn't noticed her from atop my rock. She was suddenly just there, at the very right place, at the perfect time, to save me. I'm not sure how or why. Was she some sort of guardian angel, or if she just had incredibly fortuitous timing? But whatever it was, she's likely the reason I'm even able to write this today. Kids are supposed to be innocent, living a life of joy and happiness. Whenever I see stories or news about children having thoughts that even messed up adults never have, committing atrocities against themselves or others, I'm quickly reminded that we live in a dark, dark world, and I become both sad and afraid. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find me on Twitter at Dark Prevails, or I guess that's called X now, and on YouTube at Darkness Prevails, where I narrate more stories. Make sure you follow and listen to my other show, Unexplained Encounters, especially if you prefer allegedly true stories about ghosts, monsters, and other unexplained phenomena. That's Unexplained Encounters, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Every town has that story of the kid who went too far. That kid is either in prison, dead, or has simply never been the same. Such is life. But in this story from Lay B, we learn there is an alternate and possibly more terrifying fate for that kid who thinks rules are for goobers. And that fate would be encountering disturbing beings that should not exist. Lay B warns us with her story to beware and respect the moon-eyed people of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is a tale from the Break Room. I grew up at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a sub-range of the Appalachians in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. The folklore and legends from my state always fascinated me as a kid, and my family begrudgingly tolerated my exploration of the subject. We took evening drives up the parkway to see the Brown Mountain Lights. We once drove to Bear Creek, North Carolina, to see the infamous Devil's Stomping Ground. On a trip to the Outer Banks, we made a point to visit Topsoil Island, where the Gray Lady is meant to pace the beach. The older I got, the more history intertwined with the folklore and legends from my state, and these connections always piqued my interest. In my teens, I explored cemeteries where Civil War soldiers were buried, and I navigated revolutionary battlefields with alleged sightings and hauntings. I went to a university in the South, majoring in history and folklore, graduating with honors. I paid to take courses in cemetery iconography and preservation. I volunteered with my local historical society. I did these things to understand the history of my home, but also hoped that maybe one day I would find proof that the folklore rang true, that there was something special about the legends in North Carolina which had survived through oral tradition for decades, passed down through generations of North Carolinians. It's no surprise that my career path took me into similar realms. I am a cultural heritage public historian, meaning I work for museums and sites of public history throughout North and South Carolina. My specialty is oral history. I basically supplement artifacts in museums with stories from ordinary Carolinians who choose to tell me about their lives. These stories become archived interviews, which are held in archival repositories in perpetuity. Through oral history and public history work, I've managed to turn my interest in social and local history into a career, and I've met some of the most fascinating and interesting people along the way. Ethel was one of those people that I will never forget. I first met Ethel in the fall of 2015. Museum staff were doing research for an exhibit on sharecropping, and a family friend suggested I interview her. If she agreed, of course. Sharecropping, for those unfamiliar, was an exploitative system suffered by poor farmers, both white and black, in the period after the American Civil War. Landlords contracted out land in return for a portion of the crop yield, hence the name sharecropping. The majority of sharecroppers across the South were poor white families, and it was one of the only ways for farmers to earn a living prior to the Second World War, if they didn't own any land. It was an unpredictable way of life. Sharecropping forced families to farm cash crops like tobacco and cotton for the highest yields, but also left them reliant on good growing conditions and at the mercy of the landowner. Life was so difficult under these conditions that farm families relied on the labor of their own children for help, and the children began performing chores and tasks around the farm as early as 4 or 5. Ethel was pushing 93 when I contacted her for an interview, but despite her age, she was sharp as a tack. I made the initial contact with her through a telephone call, where I explained what a life history interview was, and where I laid out the benefits of recording her oral history. She seemed wary, not of the practice of recording her story, but of the value it might have. She didn't believe her life would make an interesting story. Oh, how she was wrong about that. With additional questions asked, and with me assuring her that her experience with sharecropping was useful to our exhibit, we decided on a date and time for the interview. Now, given her age and thinking of her comfort, I suggested recording the interview in her house, which was well into the mountain region of the state. I was thrilled when she agreed, because it meant I could take advantage of staying at my grandparents' mountain home, a vacation home they had purchased in my preteen years. The mountain house, as we called it, was a 3-bedroom cabin tucked into the Grandfather Mountain area of the Blue Ridge Mountains. You had to traverse a pretty steep road with no guardrails to make it up the hill and into the gravel driveway. The house itself was 2 stories with a full basement. The basement was mostly used for laundry and the storage of deck chairs, swings, and outdoor games and equipment. The second floor had floor-to-ceiling glass windows, which looked into an open, airy living room with a massive rock fireplace. The dining area and kitchen were both on the second floor as well, as the whole floor was open concept. At the foot of the stairs leading up to the second floor was the door leading to the wraparound porch. The second floor held 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and 2 additional balconies, which overlooked the first floor wraparound porch. The house itself was built above a steep gully, maybe 20 feet deep. When my grandparents first bought the place, we all started to call this drop in the earth the gorge. As in, kids, stay well away from the edge of the gorge. The porch and second-story balconies overlooked the gorge, and we all enjoyed sitting outside and watching wildlife in and around it. As a family, we only visited the cabin during the spring, summer, and fall for get-togethers and Sunday lunch cookouts. Otherwise, the cabin offered a quiet weekend away for anyone who would find the time to make the drive. This was exactly what I hoped for the weekend I was set to interview Ethel. I planned to head to Ethel's house, interview her for a few hours, maybe do some work Friday afternoon, then spend Friday evening sipping wine on the porch of the house. Saturday, I would wander around the local museum and shops, maybe take a short hike to see some waterfalls in the area. Sunday morning, I would start down the mountain, making it home in time for Sunday lunch at my grandmother's. The following Friday, after my call with Ethel, I packed the car, eager to start the drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains. I threw an overnight bag into the back seat, along with my interview pack and a few bags of groceries, snacks, and wine. With the car loaded, I was off. I drove up the highway, snaking my way into the mountains of North Carolina, sunroof open to smell the sweet scent of rhododendron as I progressed upward. I tuned into a favorite local radio station, WNCW, and spent the journey listening to bluegrass and folk music of the mountain. I was in my element. The drive took almost 3 hours. During the last half hour or so, I lost cell service and my GPS signal. But I navigated the back roads with a paper map, arriving only 15 minutes late. When I finally pulled into Ethel's gravel drive, she was waiting for me on the porch in a weathered rocking chair, a faded knit cardigan covering her legs. "Hi there," I called after exiting the car and stretching my back. Ethel responded with a rock forward in her chair and an "mm-hmm" as she moved to stand up and walk into the house. "Come on inside," she called behind her. I noticed she was surprisingly limber for someone in their 90s. As I followed her in the house, I let the screen door slam behind me, and she motioned for me to sit before heading into the kitchen. "Y'all want some tea?" she asked from the other room. "No, ma'am. I'm okay with water for the interview," I replied, as I began unpacking my interview bag. I was setting up the recorder and the external mic, checking the batteries and volume, when she sauntered back to the sitting room with a glass of cold sweet tea in one hand and a water in the other. She sat in a worn cloth chair which engulfed her large frame. "So," she said, staring at me intently, "you're here to listen to me blather about growing up on this here mountain." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "That's exactly right, and specifically what it was like to sharecrop as a family in the 1930s. She paused, continuing to look at me. "I've got to say, I'm really excited about this, Ethel," I added. "Your family worked the land a long time, and I think your story is important to capture." She took a long sip of her tea. "All right then," she sighed. "What you want to know?" Ethel had amazing insight into the topic. She talked about the family farm. They were sharecrop farmers, as most folk in Appalachia were in those days. She picked cotton from the age of 5, tending the hogs and chicken with her 7 brothers and sisters. She told me about her responsibilities, the things she did with the little bit of leisure time they were given. She told me how she helped make the children's clothing from old feed sacks, and how she and her sisters made dolls out of sticks and twine. And she told me about her father, who helped 2 other local men make moonshine deep in the holler beyond her house. Her favorite time of year was Christmas, the only time the children got oranges, some nuts, and a bit of chocolate as Christmas gifts. I was fascinated by her history growing up in the area, and would have happily kept listening for hours. In a lull between stories, I asked, "Did all the children have jobs on the farm? It must have been a bit easier with 7 of you sharing the work." Ethel paused for a minute, looking away from me, toward the door. As an oral historian, we're trained to let people sit with their thoughts, to not interrupt, so I waited for her. After a long pause, she reflected. "Really, there were only 6 of us, not 7. You can't count Clyde. In fact, we never really talked about Clyde after the accident." I paused for a moment myself, waiting for Ethel to pick up the story, but she was silent. I wasn't surprised she had lost a sibling. Hell, it was surprising 6 of the 7 had made it past infancy, given the time period and the mortality rate in Appalachia. However, something in her silence put me on edge. I waited about 30 seconds before asking, "Ethel, can you tell me about your brother Clyde?" Ethel placed her glass of tea on the end table, not meeting my eye. She was staring down, avoiding eye contact with me. "It's a shame, really. He just didn't believe Daddy, or maybe that day he just didn't want to listen. I don't know. But he stayed out after dark and he never came back." Ethel's face depicted a mix of regret and sadness. The memory had cast a shadow over her, and really the entire room. However, this was the kind of memory that I'm trained to follow up on, although I think the key driving factor at this point was my own curiosity. "Ethel," I said, "I would really like to know more about Clyde, if you're all right talking about it." She looked at me hard, with a bit of judgment, I thought. "You didn't grow up in these mountains. You don't know the legends." She said it curtly, and there was a subsequent pause between us. "Nah, not just the legends," she said, "but the rules of what folks can and can't do. The rules that keep the balance and the harmony and keep folks safe." I was a little self-conscious, because as much as I felt I was an insider into this community, clearly she didn't see me like that. So I acknowledged her observation and asked, "Can you tell me about the legends and about these rules?" This wasn't what I'd come for. I was supposed to find out about her childhood and about sharecropping, about her life beyond the farm. But I couldn't help but follow up on this question, my own curiosity and intrigue guiding me. "Listen, child, there are rules to these mountains. You don't pay mind to things, you hear? If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. You just keep walking and you keep ignoring it, and you never run, and you never look back. Clyde knew that. We all knew that. But when you're a youngin', when you're just a boy, you don't know no better. Clyde was just a boy, really. He stayed out too long and the moon-faced people knowed it." I suddenly realized how cold and uncomfortable I felt. It was like a cold snap had engulfed the room. I had chills and suddenly felt completely underdressed for a visit to an old lady's living room. The moon-faced people? That was a new one. I racked my brain for a connection to local folklore and legend, but I had nothing. I had no idea what she was talking about. She saw it in my face, though. I must have looked confused, like I was trying to place something that I had no connection to. She countered my confusion with an explanation, possibly in the same language her mother and father used with her and the other children. "Yes, the moon-faced people. They were here well before us. The Cherokee have legends. They're only about at night with their big eyes and little bodies. They hide in the caves during the day, and they don't take no disrespect. If you stay out at night and they find you, you ain't coming back." She sat further back in her chair, reaching for her glass of tea. "And you think they had something to do with Clyde disappearing?" I asked cautiously. "Well, of course they did," she quipped. "Clyde was only about 10. He would go and play with the Simon boys 3 farms over when they had some time, but he had to cross the creek down the bottom of the holler, and he knew he had to start back home before the sun went down. Me and my younger sisters were too little to venture that far, and you know how it was. Boys were men when they was born, let to do anything. So me and my sisters would stay behind. We'd build fairy houses out of moss and stones, and we played in the yard till Mama called us in for supper, or until Clyde got back. But that night, it was sometime in the fall, before the cold snaps at night, and that night, Clyde didn't come back for supper. Daddy waited a while before he set out with our old dog and his shotgun, and I remember thinking, that gun ain't no good. The moon-faced people got him now, and he ain't coming back." Ethel looked defeated, but she sighed and sat up a little straighter, with a "what can you do" type of expression on her face. "So he never turned up? Your father didn't find anything?" I asked. "Nope. The Simon boys said he'd left their farm that night, Later than usual, mind, but not that late. Daddy looked all through the woods and some local folks joined in as well, but for 3 days, they didn't find nothing. Then, they found his body floating in one of the creek pools. Said he'd drowned. Maybe he slipped and fell in trying to get home, but I knowed better. Clyde was tough. He knew these mountains. He could swim better than any of us. It was the moon-faced people. Maybe he didn't follow the rules. Might have tried to run. Maybe he took a shortcut somewhere he ain't ought to be. Maybe you tried to talk to him. That's all it takes, you know. And do you know, none of us kids ventured off the farm for the next year at least. Mama's rules. Only Daddy went up to the still with the old dog. We was careful and we let them know that's their territory, and we ain't up to trespassing it. Ethel and I had been talking for hours at this point, and she seemed tired. She finished her tea, and after a long swallow, she said, "We didn't talk about Clyde after that year. It wasn't 'cause we didn't miss him. We was busy, you know. Daddy had lost him a farmhand, and us girls had to start doing more of the farm work. It was a hard year. But soon enough, my 3 youngest brothers came along, and we just moved on with life. Wasn't much else to do back then." That seemed to be the end of the story for Ethel, almost like she wasn't willing to discuss it further or to take more questions on the subject. I knew it was time for me to leave. I looked for a way to start wrapping things up, thanking her for her time and telling her I'd let her get back to her evening. I packed my bag with the recorder and microphone, taking the glasses back to the kitchen for her. She stood up to walk me to the door, but didn't come out onto the porch, stopping at the screen door instead. I turned around on her porch steps to tell her thank you again, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking into the woods around her house. "Our farm was just through them there trees, about half an hour's walk. I ain't never walked down to where they found Clyde, but it ain't far. That creek runs down from Tennessee and through the whole county and more. There's crags and caves in some of the gullies too. Best not to disturb any of those, 'cause that's where they hide during the day." With that, her attention snapped back to me, and she looked up to the sky. "Time you get on down the road. Shouldn't be talking about them no more. It'll be pure dark soon." I pulled my glance away from the woods, curious about the farm she'd spent the afternoon talking about. I let her know. "Oh, it's no problem, Ethel. I'm just heading down the road a bit to my grandparents' cabin for the night. I don't have very far to go, actually. Nothing like the trek up the mountain anyway. But you have a great night. I'll be in touch about the exhibit progress." I was walking toward my car when she asked, "Where's your folks' place?" "Oh, we're just over Linville Way. I'll be there for the weekend, then I'll be heading back down the mountain on Sunday." Her eyebrows furrowed for a moment, but then she gave me a wave and said, "All right then." She turned to go back into her house, pausing with her back to the screen door. "Just be careful if you're staying round here," she said over her shoulder. "Remember what I was telling about the rules and all that?" And with that word of warning, she walked into the house, closing the front door behind her. I thought about Ethel's story during the drive over to the cabin. Not so much the sharecropping bit, but the beliefs passed down through what was bound to be generations of mountain folk. Beliefs so real to them that they were used to explain a child's death and keep the other kids at home for a year. And what in the hell were moon-faced people? I was buzzing with excitement when I finally made it to the cabin. I put away my overnight bag and unloaded the groceries in the kitchen cabinets and fridge. I settled in on the couch with a glass of wine and a poor excuse for a charcuterie board, cobbled together from things I'd brought up the mountain and a block of cheese purchased on a roadside stand I'd passed coming into town. Between bites of cheese and crackers, I was researching moon-faced people in Appalachia, absorbing anything I could about these entities fresh on my radar. The creatures Ethel called moon-faced people were actually the moon-eyed people, an ancient Cherokee legend. Creatures with short, small bodies, white skin, and perhaps blue eyes, but noticeably flat faces with large hollows around the eyes. Some say they're Native American interpretation of seeing European settlers for the first time, but other sources put the moon-eyed people in the region well before the Cherokee made it their home. They're said to reside in caves during the day because of their light skin, only emerging at night, navigating by the light of the moon. Even more interesting to me was the statue that was unearthed in the 1840s of moon-eyed people. It was found in Butler, North Carolina, on what would have marked a prominent road during the Trail of Tears, when Native Americans were displaced from their homelands and forced to relocate to the west, often on foot. More archaeological evidence supposedly sits in Georgia, at Fort Mountain State Park, where an erected stone wall is attributed to the moon-eyed people, built as protection from the Cherokee. I stayed glued to my computer for another hour, reading everything I could find, although most sites and stories just corroborated each other. Cherokee legend, small people, possibly blue eyes, but definitely round hollow eye areas. Only come out at night due to light sensitivity and live in caves. One thing that did baffle me was the locality of these stories. They spanned the westernmost portions of North Carolina, around Cherokee County, into Georgia and Tennessee. Ethel's family resided hours from this area, and that was with modern roads. The legend had obviously traveled throughout the mountain region by word of mouth. My research was interrupted after about an hour by a phone call from my mother. "Hi, honey. How did the interview go?" I grabbed my cigarettes and lighter and an old heavy coat hanging by the door before heading out to the porch to speak to her. "It went really well. Fascinating, even," I said, as I plopped into one of the rocking chairs, overlooking the steep gorge behind the house. "The sharecropping stories will be perfect for the exhibit, and I've asked her to see if she can find old photos to better represent the family. You know, give a face to the voice telling the story. That kind of thing. She's gonna get back to me on that next week." Mom seemed pleased it went well, and started to change the subject to discussions around what we would make for Sunday lunch, when I stopped her. "Mom, there's one more thing, though. The end of the interview was, well, I don't know. Maybe spooky is the right word." "What do you mean?" she asked. I took a long drag from my cigarette, then launched into the story Ethel had told about her brother Clyde and the moon-faced people. I told her about the harmony that supposedly existed between folks on the mountain and these entities, about Ethel's warnings and about the rules. I then explained what I'd found in the few hours of research I was able to do before she called. "I mean, there are actual statues, Mom. I even thought about driving out to the museum in Butler tomorrow to see this thing in real life. Can you imagine uncovering such an artifact in your own backyard, knowing it was left behind during one of the most horrific events of ethnic cleansing in American history? It's just wild." "Well," my mother didn't seem to know exactly how to respond to all this. "She couldn't have told her story to a more interested party, I'll give you that. But you know, Leigh, you're up there by yourself this weekend. Maybe you should shelf any other research until you're back home. I don't want you winding yourself up. Besides, you know how mountain folk can be. It's all superstition built around teaching kids lessons. These moon people, or whatever they're called, it's just a way to warn their kids to be home on time, not to stay out after dark, advise against entering caves, those sorts of things." I was a little annoyed at her reaction. She knew I was passionate about any folklore-related topics, yet it felt like I was being brushed off. I finished my cigarette and pulled my jacket closer. The wind was starting to blow colder through the trees. "Right, well, I'm gonna head inside now and finish my glass of wine. Might just call it an early night. Besides, the wind is picking up and I'm freezing out on this porch. She sighed. "All right." She could tell I was annoyed with her response. "Well, have a good night, and I'll speak to you later. Make sure you wake up in time that you're not late for Sunday lunch, too." "Got it, Mom. I'll see you soon." I hung up the phone in a huff. Despite the cold, I wasn't really ready to go inside yet. I stood up, lighting another cigarette and walking over to the balcony edge. The gorge below was steep, but the house was built to make use of its depth and natural beauty. When they first bought the house, we were all scared of falling off the balcony and into that gully, and the adults took extra measures to make sure the smaller kids did not go near the edge. It wasn't terribly deep, though. You could see the bottom, covered in limbs and leaves, and my cousins and I used to vow we were going to find the other side one day. The opening couldn't be far, and we were sure it led to caves and curiosities, but we never attempted to find it. Without thinking, I looked down and yelled a loud, "Hello!" into the gorge. It was too windy to hear much of an echo. I yelled again, "Hello!" But all I heard were trees rustling in the wind. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the forest, enjoying the cold against my face. I finished my cigarette while leaning against the porch railing, looking up at the sky. It was a dark night, too cloudy to see stars. I turned back to the gorge momentarily, ready to get inside, into the warmth, when something caught my eye. I paused and tried to concentrate my stare on the pale thing at the bottom of the gorge. It was roundish, with an almost iridescent coloring. It wasn't bright, just pale. And moving? Was it moving? The thing was shifting itself as if it were walking. At times I could make out the roundish head. Then it would disappear into the side of the gorge nearest me, blocking it from view. I stood there another 2 minutes, watching it saunter along at the bottom of the gorge. It was so dark, I could only make out its movements from the pale, hazy light it cast. It wasn't moving fast, and at first it reminded me of a deer sauntering through the forest, stopping to nibble at grass, in no hurry to move on. Just as that thought entered my mind, just as I thought, there's no way this can be a deer, the figure disappeared into the left side of the embankment, and it was gone. I waited another few minutes, but I saw nothing. I was suddenly so cold, chilled from the wind, but also by this thing. This dull moving light at the bottom of a gorge that was, from my understanding, inaccessible for miles. Maybe my mom had a point, and I had just creeped myself out. That, coupled with staying alone in the cabin, probably caused me to see something that wasn't actually there. With a shiver, I grabbed my cigarettes and moved to walk inside the cabin, giving one last glance to the gorge, but seeing nothing but darkness. I decided to put away my laptop for the night. Turning on the TV for a distraction, I settled onto the couch with a blanket and a glass of wine. I found a romantic comedy I'd seen about a dozen times and tried to let it distract me from my thoughts of those moon-eyed people, and from whatever I just saw. My mind raced through the possibility that I'd just seen some sort of animal, that maybe it wasn't as cloudy as I'd thought. Maybe the moonlight managed to illuminate portions of the gorge, and that's what I equated to its movement. But none of the explanations made sense. After my third glass of wine, and with lower inhibitions, I decided to heck with this. I should be able to go back out onto the porch and have a cigarette. Moon-eyed people be damned. Once again, I grabbed the heavy coat from the rack, stuck my cigarettes and lighter into the pocket, and opened the porch door. It was quieter now. The wind had died down a bit, and I could hear the sounds of the forest around me. I settled into my rocking chair, deliberately looking away from the gorge. I lit my cigarette and began rocking, my eyes fixed on the opposite side of the porch, toward my parked car. The squeak of the rocking chair was calming as I rocked back and forth, lulling myself into a sense of calm where I was safe. Where I was in the mountains surrounded by forest and scents of fresh fauna, at my family's favorite place. I was remembering a particularly fond family cookout on that very porch when I heard it. Someone somewhere said my name.
Lay!
My whole body tensed as I abruptly stopped rocking. I sat completely still, letting my cigarette burn as I listened closely. I heard it again, quietly, almost like a whisper. I heard a pleading voice call, Lay. My one-syllable name was elongated to 3 or 4 seconds. Its tone begged me to respond, almost as though it were in pain, almost as though it needed my help. I felt my heart beating hard in my chest. My body was tense as I sat as still and as quiet as possible. I sat this way for minutes without hearing a sound outside of the rustle of wind in the trees. It was long enough that I started disputing with myself that I'd heard anything at all. Maybe it was just the wind. Wasn't that what people always said when they heard sounds in the woods while alone? The tension had subsided with the passing time, and I could feel my body giving up its rigidity of the last 5 minutes when I heard the name again. This time it was fast and angry, and it was louder.
Lay!
It seemed to be coming from all sides of the gorge. I couldn't place it as I hurriedly stood up, knocking over the side table next to me. I hesitantly looked over the balcony for the source of the sound, or for the pale light, for anything that might explain what I'd heard and seen this evening. Soon, I saw it. Straight across from me. Not in the gorge any longer, but on the opposite side, directly across from me. It was pale with a round face and hollows for eyes. It was a short humanoid form, slight in build, but I could make out the legs and arms for the first time. I froze. Maybe it was the wine, but I felt as though I could not move, like my brain was trying to register what it was seeing. I was staring at this thing, trying to make sense of what it could be. But then it started to move. It was walking, slowly, parallel to the porch, with just the opening of the gorge between us. A rush of panic flooded my senses, and I opened my mouth to scream. I almost choked on the sound, trying to escape my lungs, when a dawning recognition struck. I remembered Ethel's warning. I remembered the rules. And I remembered what happened when Clyde didn't follow them. You don't pay mind to things, you hear? If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. You just keep walking, and you ignore it, and you never run, and you never look back. My thoughts were flooded with the realization that I'd spoken about the moon-eyed people aloud, on the porch, to my mother. I shared the deep Appalachian folklore passed down quietly through families for generations. I went so far as to question their existence on that call, to share I was doing research in an effort to understand where this myth, this folklore, originated. I spoke about artifacts being found and historical connections throughout the region. My mind recalled all the talking points. What exactly had I said? Did I do something to draw them to me? The gorge would be the perfect place for them. Dark and cavernous, with so little access from the outside world, so little reach for the sun's rays. I was still staring at the figure as it continued to walk, its pale form navigating the ridge slowly and deliberately. Its pale face was turned toward me as it walked, with little attention to the forest floor. Outwardly, I was shaking. I'd crossed my arms, hugging my torso for comfort. I felt sick. My mind was racing, but I managed to pull my thoughts together to try to be practical. Right, I thought. I didn't actually see it, and I didn't actually hear anything. I'll turn around, walk back into the cabin, and just lock up for the night. I'll pull the blinds and barricade myself in the master bedroom. All I need is the morning light. All I need is to wait it out until morning. As it continued to walk slowly along the ridge, I turned away, pulling my gaze from the creature. I began to calmly walk inside. I locked the porch door behind me, lowering the small blind on the door's glass. I went into the living room with its high ceilings and tall windows built for the morning sunlight. The room felt unsafe now, with clear views of the road leading to the cabin. I turned off the TV, pulling the curtains on the first floor windows, the only curtains available to close. I continued this throughout the first floor, closing the kitchen blinds, the ones in the small dining room. I left the light on, and all the lamps. Then I made my way to the master bedroom on the second floor. The master had a small balcony overlooking the gorge as well. In fact, all the bedrooms overlooked the gorge, facing the back of the house. I locked myself inside the room, then made sure the door to the balcony was locked. I pulled the curtains tight against the balcony door and sat on the bed, my heart pounding. But my adrenaline was starting to wane. It was approaching midnight at this point, and having drank a bottle of wine with cheese and crackers for supper, my eyes were growing heavy regardless of my pounding heart. I did not want to fall asleep, even though I was exhausted. I quickly turned on all 3 lamps in the room for more light, hoping that this would deter anything from trying to come into the house. The moon-eyed people couldn't stand light, so surely I was safe in a lamp-lit bedroom. I crawled under my covers, my phone in hand in case of an emergency, and I waited. For half an hour, nothing happened. No calls of my name or even loud whistling of the wind. Eventually, my exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep at some point. The bedside alarm clock read 3:22 when I awoke in the dark. I was confused as to where I was for a moment, looking around the dark bedroom for something familiar. Then the situation rushed back to me, and I sat straight up. All 3 lights, my beacons of hope and saving grace, had been switched off. Was it a power cut? It couldn't be. The alarm clock still worked. Then I noticed the light of the moon. It was pouring in through the glass balcony doors. The clouds must have dissipated at some point in the night. I scrambled to the left side of the bed, as far away from the balcony doors I could get, looking in terror as the moonlight streamed in. The electricity is one thing, but I distinctly remembered closing the curtains. They were my protection against seeing the moon-eyed people again, against seeing the gorge at all. I began to shake with panic. My phone lay on the bed, feet away from me. But who would I call? What would I even tell someone if I called? I was being targeted by what? A Cherokee legend? I tried the bedside lamp. The switch clicked on and off, but no light. If the electricity was out, maybe my phone had enough battery to provide some light. If I could grab my phone and turn on the flashlight, I could potentially dash to the balcony, close the curtains again, and check the lock on the bedroom door. Then it was only 2.5 hours until sunrise. I was sure I could stay alert for 2.5 hours. I crawled along the bed to grab my phone, then quickly ambled to the left side, as far away from the balcony as possible. 30% battery. A relief flooded over me. I switched it on and left it face down on the side table, illuminating most of the room. I took a few deep breaths, trying to muster the courage to run to the balcony door. I waited a few minutes, listening intently and hearing nothing before I finally convinced myself to move. In a mad dash, I jumped off the bed, running to the balcony door to pull the curtains. I got the right curtain closed, and I went to grab the left, when that pale light caught my eye again. It was below me, standing next to the rocking chair I'd left just a few hours ago. The moon-eyed thing. I could see it now a little better. Still a humanoid figure with distinct arms and legs. It was just a body though, no clothing, but small in stature, maybe 3.5 feet high. Its whole body was glowing pale, but its face was so wrong. It was very round with no discernible mouth. The most striking feature were those hollow eyes, almost gape-like, and I couldn't see anything but holes. It was standing adjacent to the porch door, beside the rocking chair, in the exact spot I'd stood while watching it walk parallel to the gorge, and now it was staring straight up at my balcony doors. It wasn't a full moon, and I only looked for a few seconds. But that image, that feeling of invasiveness, that it had invaded my property, my sense of safety, and that it knew which room I was currently in, that feeling will never leave me. I jerked the left side of the curtains closed and threw myself onto the bed, crying uncontrollably. How had it made it to my porch? That gully stretched throughout the valley, and I was unaware of where to even cross it. More so, what the hell had I done to draw these things to me? With that thought, I started to imagine what Clyde could have possibly done to anger these moon-eyed people. Had he seen the same thing I was seeing now? Clyde, whose story had brought us here, and Ethel, who shared a family legend, some mountain folklore, then me, who stupidly repeated it all out loud into the gorge. I stayed curled up against the top of the bed frame for what felt like an hour, with only the phone illuminating the room. Soon it would be morning, I kept telling myself. Soon this will all be over, and I can go home, and I will swear off this whole region. I would stay happily in the Piedmont, avoiding any cave or gorge or dark forest for the rest of my life, if I could only survive this night. I hugged my legs and cried. I cried until I eventually fell asleep, sometime after 4 a.m. I awoke to light streaming in through the balcony curtains. It was the soft sunlight of dawn, and the illumination around the curtain's edges was the most incredible sight of my life. My eyes were puffy and irritated from crying, but I got up off the bed and slowly opened the curtains. It was a gorgeous morning. The gorge and ridge surrounding the cabin were glowing with the morning sun, illuminating trees just beginning to turn to their autumnal reds and golds, and a slight dusting of frost on the ground below. I slowly peeled the curtains back and looked down at the porch. The rocking chair sat motionless, the side table still overturned. But, other than that, it was just as I'd left it last night. There were no signs, or not that I could see from above, of the moon-eyed people. I fully opened the curtains, then tried the bedside lamp. It turned on at the click of the switch. So did the lamp in the corner, and the one on the desk. The electricity was working just fine. I sat down on the edge of the bed, confused, and with a bit of a headache. I remembered everything so vividly. I saw something in that gorge. It then reappeared out of the gorge, on the other side of the embankment, and it terrified me by coming onto my porch, standing exactly where I'd been when I first glimpsed it, staring up at me, up at my bedroom. All of it never felt like a dream, and I never doubted it. I had been more scared than I'd ever been in my life after seeing it, and that is not something you simply dream. It was that moment that I flew into action. I splashed some water on my face and began packing my toiletries. I'd hardly unpacked my overnight bag, but I changed into my leggings and a sweatshirt, throwing my pajamas into the bag. I grabbed my phone and its charger, and I took the stairs 2 by 2. As soon as I reached the landing, it hit me. It was incredibly bright in the living room. I glanced around and realized that every single curtain and blind that I'd closed were now completely open. The large windows in the living room were fully visible, streaming in the morning sunlight. The curtains I'd closed last night, the ones covering the ground floor glass, were open. The kitchen and dining room too. Even the small shade covering the porch door was pulled open. It was as though it was sending a sign that I hadn't been safe from them, and that the light was no obstacle at night. That same anxious adrenaline flooded me again as I set my bag on the couch. I tried the lamp in the living room. It worked, clicking on and off. My initial thoughts were validated. It wasn't electrical. There was no outage. This was something else. This was a targeted attack on the lamps in my bedroom that somehow stopped once it was light outside. This was a message meant to warn me, to show me that I had somehow trespassed or disrespected these people. I stood another few minutes just gazing around the room, thinking about the curtains, about the lights, when I decided it was time to get the heck out of this house. I grabbed the few groceries I had stored in the kitchen, shoving them into grocery bags. I left the wine glass and plate in the kitchen sink, not wanting to stay long enough to wash and put them away. I was at the front door in under 2 minutes, grabbing my keys as I reached for the handle. I turned the knob and opened it when I stopped. The door was unlocked, even the deadbolt, which I had absolutely locked when I came back from my interview with Ethel. My hands were shaking as I pulled open the door and bolted out. I locked both locks, taking the stairs 2 by 2 down to my car. It was 6:50 a.m. when I started my car and began reversing down the drive. There would be no museum visit for me, and I definitely would not be staying around long enough to visit the national park, quaint town, or the immensely popular attraction, the Linville Gorge. I was done with the Blue Ridge Mountains, and more of a believer than I'd ever been. I called Ethel the next week to follow up on our conversation. I thanked her again, noting how invaluable it would be to preserve her memory of mountain life. We exchanged pleasantries for as long as was comfortable, and I was ready to end that call and my ties to Ethel when she remarked, "Those stories about Clyde, those memories I tell to you, you can't use them for the museum." I wasn't surprised. Narrators often have objections to certain things shared in the heat of the moment. I assured her, "Oh no, Ethel, those stories aren't really relevant here. In fact, if you wanted me to remove them from the interview audio itself, I can do that. You can still archive your interview, but we won't include those portions, as they're quite personal to you." "Ain't because they're personal, eh?" I was surprised at how exasperated she seemed, and a little confused. "We can't be talking about them, that's all. I don't know if I should have even told you." "Right," I said. I knew exactly what she meant. I knew more than she could have ever imagined. I said uneasily, "By the way, Ethel, I had an experience at my grandparents' house after I left our interview." She was completely silent. "I was just wondering if you thought maybe—" She cut me off. "If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. I hope to God you just kept walking and you ignored it, and that you didn't run, and you never looked back. That's all I'm gonna say on that. Some of us folks still have to live in these here hollers." I had nothing to say except, "Yes, ma'am." With that, our call ended, and I never ever spoke openly about the Moonite people again. My mom tried to follow up at Sunday lunch, asking why I'd ended my trip early and how the research was going. I let her know it was a bit of a disappointment, that I'd found nothing else, and it seemed it was just a legend after all. In fact, I announced I don't even think Ethel was speaking about the same folklore or legend I'd found. None of it added up, but that was all a lie. There was nothing to the stories at all, I lied. My family feigned interest for all of 20 minutes, but the topic was never broached again. As for that house, the mountain house, I didn't return for any family gatherings for the next 3 years. By 2018, my grandparents had decided to list it. While I was sad that part of my life would be gone, I was also relieved. I had an excuse to never step foot on that mountain again, and to never have to see that gorge. I moved to Scotland 6 years ago, and it's only now I feel comfortable sharing anything about this encounter. I'm still not sure what exactly those things were, because I stopped researching, and I stopped searching for answers. I amended the audio before giving it to the museum, so no one has ever heard Ethel's story, and I never spoke about it to anyone aside from my mom. I share this mostly to document a legend that I'd never heard of, but has now fundamentally shaped my life because I did not listen to the advice given to me. I also share it out of respect for the rules and the harmony that folks in the Appalachian Mountains have lived by for decades. I still love to read about North Carolina history, and I miss the beauty of the Blue Ridge Parkway in the fall. But thoughts of that region beyond that fill me with anxiety and dread. So, please, learn from my experience before careless actions leave you with the most traumatic experience of your life. Don't sweep folklore and legends under the rug of fiction. Often these stories linger because they serve an important purpose. Maybe it's to warn folks about staying out after dark or traveling dangerous paths. Sometimes, however, it's a reminder that we share this world with beings that wish to be left alone, lest you suffer a painful price. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. And if you want more of my scary story narrations, find my other show, Unexplained Encounters, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Also, you can send me your scary work stories at eriecast.com/submit. Till next time, everyone, I'd better clock out. But I'll be clocking in again real soon.